Hello there, fellow night owls, and welcome to tonight's gentle waltz back in time. I'm so glad you've joined me for another journey into the past. Tonight, we'll be exploring the long and winding path that led to the ultimate downfall of one of the greatest empires the world has ever known, the Roman Empire. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. Are you curled up in bed after a long day, ready to drift off to sleep? Or perhaps you're just looking for a bit of calm and relaxation during your waking hours. Either way, I'm honored to be your guide on this historical journey. If you enjoy immersive, relaxing storytelling that combines fascinating history with soothing narration, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. We'll be exploring many more captivating tales from our shared past in future episodes. But for now, let's gently turn our attention to ancient Rome. Close your eyes and imagine yourself transported back in time, over 2,000 years ago. Picture the bustling streets of Rome at the height of its power and glory, the grand marble temples and monuments gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, the forum buzzing with the chatter of politicians, merchants, and ordinary citizens going about their daily lives, mighty legions marching out from the city gates, destined to expand the reach of the empire to the farthest corners of the known world. It must have seemed, in those golden years, that Rome would endure forever, that its wealth, its power, and its sheer indomitable spirit could never be broken. But even the mightiest of empires can fall, and Rome was no exception. The story of Rome's downfall is a long and complex one, spanning centuries of wars, political intrigues, economic upheavals, and seismic social and religious shifts. There was no single cause, no one fatal blow, but rather a slow unraveling as cracks formed in the very foundations of Roman power and prestige. Over the next few hours, we'll calmly meander through the winding history of Rome's decline, pausing to examine some of the key moments and figures that shaped its destiny. We'll meet emperors both wise and foolish, generals both valiant and vainglorious, and a vibrant cast of everyday Romans living through extraordinary times. So, make yourself comfortable, take a slow deep breath, and let the modern world fade away as we embark on our journey back through the mists of time to explore the twilight years of the once indomitable Roman Empire. Our story begins in the closing years of the 2nd century AD. On the surface, the empire appeared to be at the peak of its strength and stability. The frontiers were secure, the economy was thriving, and a series of wise and capable rulers known as the 5 Good Emperors had ushered in an era of peace and prosperity. But beneath this veneer of invincibility, cracks were beginning to show in the foundations of Roman power. These hairline fractures would eventually spider and spread until the once solid bedrock of the empire crumbled away entirely. One of the earliest warning signs was a slow but steady erosion of the authority and competence of the imperial office itself. For generations, the empire had been guided by a succession of rulers who embodied the sober discipline and civic-minded virtue that had long been held up as quintessentially Roman ideals. But as the 2nd century drew to a close, a new breed of emperor began to ascend the throne, men more interested in the trappings and pleasures of power than in the arduous work of governance. One of the most notorious of these new rulers was Commodus, son and heir of the revered philosopher king Marcus Aurelius. Commodus came to power in 177 AD at the age of just 19. But while his father had been a paragon of wisdom and duty, Commodus was a vain and capricious youth who cared more for the adulation of the mob than for the weighty responsibilities of empire. He fancied himself a gladiator and would frequently descend into the arena to fight against terrified opponents who had been instructed to submit to the emperor's blows. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, and even rechristened the months of the year after his own various titles and honorifics. As Commodus indulged his whims and neglected the work of government, the once solid foundations of imperial authority began to crack and erode. The Senate, which had long served as a check on the excesses of emperors, found itself increasingly sidelined and ignored. The military, sensing the weakness at the heart of the empire, began to assert its own prerogatives. In 192 AD, after more than a decade of misrule, Commodus was finally assassinated in a palace coup. But his death did little to restore stability or integrity to the imperial office. In the coming years, Rome would be racked by a series of short-lived, often violently deposed emperors as various factions within the military and the Senate vied for control. This cycle of assassination and turnover reached a fever pitch with the rise of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard. Originally created to protect the emperor, the Praetorians soon became a king-making force unto themselves, installing and removing rulers almost at will in exchange for bribes and political favors. In the span of just 16 years, from 235 to 251 AD, no fewer than 20 emperors claimed the throne, many only for a matter of months before being dispatched by their own guards or by rival claimants. The once inviolable dignity of the imperial office had been reduced to little more than a hollow crown, to be bought, bartered, or seized by force. But the rot afflicting Rome in these years was not confined to the imperial palace alone. Even as the political foundations of the empire were fracturing, its economic underpinnings were beginning to crumble as well. For centuries, Rome's wealth and power had been sustained by a robust system of agriculture, trade, and tribute from conquered provinces. But as the 3rd century dawned, this once vibrant economy was showing signs of strain. In the countryside, centuries of intensive cultivation had begun to exhaust the fertility of the soil, leading to declining crop yields and the slow abandonment of once productive farms. In the cities, the debasement of the silver currency by a succession of cash-strapped emperors led to rampant inflation and a loss of confidence in the money supply. And on the empire's frontiers, the unceasing pressure of hostile tribes and rival powers was forcing Rome to pour ever greater resources into maintaining its borders. Resources that might otherwise have been invested in shoring up the economy at home. These mounting economic woes only added to the sense of drift and decay that was gradually pervading every corner of Roman society. The grand facade of the empire might still have looked imposing from afar. The legions still marched. The monuments still gleamed. But up close, the cracks in the foundation were becoming harder and harder to ignore. It would be a mistake, of course, to imagine that these cracks appeared all at once, or that their full implications were immediately apparent to those living through these troubled times. The decline of Rome was a slow and subtle process, unfolding across generations. Many Romans no doubt carried on with their daily lives much as they always had, tending to their trades and their families, celebrating festivals and mourning losses, largely insulated from the great currents of history shifting beneath their feet. But with the benefit of hindsight, we can see the seeds of Rome's ultimate downfall being planted in these years of creeping dysfunction and doubt. The once unshakable edifice of Roman power was already growing brittle, even as the empire continued to expand its frontiers and assert its might on the world stage. In the coming hours, we'll see how these early fault lines would widen into yawning chasms as the Roman world was rocked by fresh waves of invasions, insurrections, and internecine strife. We'll meet the emperors and usurpers, saints and barbarians who would shape Rome's destiny in its final centuries. But as we explore these turbulent times together, I invite you to hold in your mind the image of Rome at its height. The Rome of Augustus and Trajan, of Cicero and Virgil. The Rome that built roads and aqueducts that still endure to this day. that gave us systems of law and governance that still shape our world in profound and subtle ways. That Rome, the eternal city on the seven hills, the Caput Mundi, the center of the world, can seem impossibly remote to us now, separated from our modern reality by an unfathomable gulf of years. But in the flickering light of our historical imagination, we can still catch glimpses of its faded glory. So as we gently drift through these next chapters in Rome's long decline, let us pay our respects to the monumental achievement that was the Roman Empire, and to the fragile, fallible individuals who lived and struggled within its vast embrace, not so very different from you or me. With that in mind, let us slip softly into the rich and dreamlike realm of Rome's past, and immerse ourselves in the captivating story of its decline as the first cracks begin to spread through the mighty foundations of empire. I'll be right here, my voice a soothing constant, guiding you through the complex web of characters and events. There's no need to strain to remember every detail. Simply let the story wash over you and allow your mind to paint its own vivid pictures of this vanished world. And if at any time you feel your eyelids growing heavy or your thoughts beginning to wander, know that it's all right to let yourself drift off into gentle sleep. The story will be here waiting for you when you return. So close your eyes now, take a slow, deep breath, and let the world of ancient Rome materialize around you. Picture the marble columns and triumphal arches, the golden eagles on scarlet standards snapping in the wind. Hear the distant tread of legionary boots, the laughter and chatter of the forum crowds, the metal-on-metal clang of gladiators sparring in the arena. And as the scene sets itself and the journey begins, know that you are in good company. For we are all, in our own way, heirs to the legacy of Rome, both its triumphs and its tragedies, its wisdom and its folly. In exploring this vanished empire's rise and fall, we are in a sense exploring the very roots of our own civilization, the deep and tangled taproot from which so much of our modern world has grown. It's a legacy that we carry with us, consciously or not, in the very language we speak, the laws we obey, the roads we travel, the stories we tell. A legacy so vast and so enduring that it can be difficult at times to perceive its full scope and grandeur. But tonight, as we embark together on this journey through Rome's fading twilight, we have a chance to step back and marvel at the sheer sweep and drama of this civilization's arc, to feel the weight and heft of all those centuries pressing down upon us, even as they lift us up on the wings of wonder. So let us begin, you and I, here at the hinge of Rome's fortunes, with the empire still clad in the raiment of its power, but with the first threads already beginning to fray. The journey will be long and winding, strewn with the wreckage of war and the glinting gold of glory. But I promise you, by the time we reach its end, we will have seen the soul of a civilization laid bare, in all its splendor and all its sorrow. Content warning. This script contains a brief non-graphic reference to violence. As the crisis of the 3rd century finally began to recede and a battered Rome caught its breath under the reign of Diocletian, new threats loomed on the horizon. The empire's sheer size and wealth had long attracted envious eyes from the tribes and confederations who lived in the lands beyond the Danube and Rhine. Groups like the Goths, Vandals, Saxons and Franks had clashed with Rome for centuries. Roman armies would frequently cross the frontier to pacify and subjugate these so-called barbarians, either incorporating them into the empire or using them as a buffer against even more distant foes. But now, the tables were starting to turn. As we've seen, the upheavals of the 3rd century had left the Roman military severely weakened and depleted. Legions that had once seemed invincible now struggled to repel increasingly bold raids and incursions by Germanic warriors. Slowly but surely, the military balance of power was shifting. Barbarian warbands were evolving into powerful tribal kingdoms, with sophisticated political structures and capable leaders. They looked upon Rome's weakening grip on its frontier provinces and sensed an opportunity. As the 4th century dawned, one tribe in particular would emerge as the Romans' most formidable adversary. The Goths were an East Germanic people who had migrated from southern Scandinavia to the region north of the Black Sea in the early 1st millennium AD. For nearly a century, the Goths had been a familiar presence along the lower Danube, sometimes fighting the Romans as enemies, other times serving the emperors as allies. In the early 300s, the Goths divided into two distinct branches, the Visigoths in the west and Ostrogoths in the east. Their rise to power would be spurred by a looming menace from the steppes of Central Asia. The Huns were a nomadic people whose origins and ethnic makeup are still clouded in mystery. What's clear is that their westward push in the late 300s set off a chain reaction that would shake an already wobbly Roman world to its core. Fleeing the Hunnic advance, the Visigoths sought permission to cross the Danube frontier and settle inside the empire. In a decision that would have momentous consequences, the Emperor Valens agreed, allowing the tribe to establish itself in the Balkans in 376. It was a move born of expediency, not friendship. Valens hoped the Goths could serve as a first line of defense against the Huns, while also providing a handy pool of recruits for the perennially short-handed legions. But any illusions of an easy alliance were swiftly shattered. Once across the river, the Goths were subjected to brutal mistreatment by the local Roman authorities. Desperate for food and angered by their shabby welcome, the tribe rose in rebellion. In 378, the crisis came to a head at the fateful Battle of Adrianople. Leading a massive army, Emperor Valens confidently marched out to crush the Gothic upstarts. But in the parched plains near the city, the Romans blundered into a catastrophic defeat. Trapped and surrounded by the Gothic cavalry, the imperial army was massacred. Valens himself was killed in the slaughter, becoming the first emperor to fall in battle against a barbarian foe. The shockwaves from Adrianople reverberated across the empire. The Eastern Roman army had been gutted, leaving the Goths free to roam and plunder the Balkan provinces at will. It was a grim sign of things to come. More tribes now rushed to exploit Rome's vulnerability. On the last day of 406, a massive force of Alans, Vandals, and Suebi poured across the Rhine, overwhelming the Roman defences. Like a great wave, the Germanic invaders now crashed over Gaul, Hispania, and other once secure provinces. The unthinkable suddenly seemed possible. After centuries of keeping the barbarians at bay, the frontiers had completely collapsed. Lands that had been Roman for 500 years or more now fell under the sway of Germanic kings and warlords. The Goths, meanwhile, went from triumph to triumph. After years of drifting across the Balkan provinces, they were now led by a capable young king named Alaric, a shrewd tactician with Roman military training. Alaric dreamed of winning a permanent homeland for his people. In 408, the Visigoths invaded Italy itself, the sacrosanct heart of the empire. After 2 grueling sieges, Alaric's army stood at the gates of Rome. The Senate, which had once commanded kings and decided the fates of nations, was reduced to sending a pathetic plea for mercy. The mighty city would be spared, the envoys promised, if Alaric would accept their pitiful bribe of gold, silver, silk, scarlet cloth, and pepper. According to the historian Zosimus, Alaric roared with laughter at this offer, quipping, "The thicker the hay, the easier it is mowed." He demanded a far greater ransom, and the Romans had no choice but to pay, but it was only a temporary reprieve. In 410, the Visigoths returned. This time, the gates were flung open by rebellious slaves, and Rome fell to its attackers. Alaric's army poured into the capital, burning and looting as they went. For the first time in nearly 800 years, Rome had been conquered by a foreign enemy. The shock was profound, prompting much anguished reflection among the empire's elites. "It is my prayer, dearest son," wrote St. Jerome in the aftermath, "that you may live among these things as a pilgrim, a sojourner, a citizen of Jerusalem, not of Babylon. Our tears are dried by the thought that God has spared us to warn others." Though the city itself still stood, the fall of Rome marked a crucial turning point. In a world where civilizations were thought to rise and fall according to the whims of the gods, it was seen by many as a sign of divine abandonment, a punishment for the empire's sins. The Visigothic sack was far from the last indignity the beleaguered Romans would face. In 429, the Vandals, under their king Genseric, invaded North Africa, wrenching the Diocese of Africa from imperial control. It was a devastating strategic loss. North Africa, with its rich agricultural lands, had long been the breadbasket of the Western Empire. Its vital grain shipments fed the swelling populace of Rome and other cities. With that province gone, the imperial heartland faced crippling food shortages. The loss of Africa also meant the loss of the lucrative taxes and revenues that had flowed from the region into the imperial treasury. Already reeling from the depredations of the invaders, Rome's economy entered freefall. With its finances in ruins, fields gone fallow, and borders under siege, the Western Empire's position grew increasingly untenable. The Vandals' conquest of Carthage in 439 marked the de facto end of Roman rule in North Africa. Its shattered remnants would limp on for 3 decades more, but the West was now careening toward oblivion. As the 5th century reached its midpoint, the Western throne had become a grim game of musical chairs. A rapid succession of emperors tried and failed to stem the empire's bleeding. In 475, a general named Orestes seized control of the court at Ravenna and named his young son Romulus as emperor. The child ruler would be mockingly dubbed Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus. In a twist of historical irony, the last emperor of Rome bore the names of both the city's mythical founder and the man who had inaugurated the imperial age. Little did young Romulus know that he would also be the one to close that chapter. His reign would be brief, more of a poignant footnote than a real attempt to resurrect Western imperial glory. In 476, Orestes refused demands from his barbarian mercenaries for land in Italy. Their response was swift and decisive. The Germanic general Odoacer defeated and killed Orestes in battle, then marched on Ravenna. In a final indignity, Romulus Augustulus was forced to abdicate the throne. According to some accounts, Odoacer took pity on the boy, sparing his life and allowing him to live out his days in comfortable exile on a country estate. With that anticlimactic act, the long, turbulent history of the Western Roman Empire shuddered to a halt. Odoacer now proclaimed himself King of Italy, ruling the peninsula on behalf of his patron, the Eastern Emperor Zeno. Of course, the story of Rome was far from over. The Eastern Empire, increasingly regarded as the Byzantine Empire, would endure for nearly 1,000 years more, until falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. And the ideal of a universal European empire, inaugurated by Augustus so many centuries before, would continue to transfix kings and conquerors for generations to come. But the dream of a unified Roman Empire, a single state encompassing the full scope of the Mediterranean world, had perished. Rome, the eternal city on the 7 hills, would pass into the realm of wistful legend, a hazy memory of past glories forever pined after, but never again attained. And so, in this quiet hour, we ponder the long and winding path that led the Romans to their final destination. In telling the tale of their decline and fall, what lessons might we discern for our own civilization? Perhaps above all, Rome offers a cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial hubris. At the height of its power, Rome's dominion had seemed eternal and unshakable. The empire's sheer size and scope allowed its rulers to grow complacent, blind to the cracks emerging in the very foundations of their society. They failed to reckon with the tectonic forces that gnawed at the roots of Roman power, the crisis of legitimacy that ate away at the imperial office, the widening gulf between rich and poor, the slow rot of civic virtue and martial prowess. In their arrogance, they assumed that the barbarian tribes would always remain querulous inferiors, awed by the splendor of Rome and content with their place in its shadow. They failed to imagine that the societies on their periphery might one day eclipse them in strength and supplant them as masters of the world. For centuries, Rome thrived on relentless conquest and expansion, always seeking to push its frontiers further out. But in time, that sprawling frontier became a source of weakness, not strength, an impossible expanse to patrol and defend. And yet, even as Rome receded from history's main stage, its legacy would endure. It lived on in the splendor of Constantinople, in the soaring architecture of medieval cathedrals, in the Latin that would remain Europe's lingua franca of learning and statecraft. It shaped the art, philosophy, and institutions that would form the bedrock of Western civilization. The heirs of Rome may have turned to new gods and spoken new tongues, but they continued to draw guidance and inspiration from the old empire's faded triumphs. Even the Renaissance, that great reawakening of art and knowledge, saw itself as the rebirth of a classical ideal that had never truly perished. So rest now, dear friends, and ponder the long, completed journey of a civilization that once seemed eternal. In the morning's light, its monuments will still stand in mute testament to the heights that humanity can ascend, and its cracked and weathered ruins will whisper of the dangers of taking such glories for granted, and the ephemeral nature of even the mightiest works of mortal hands. The Goths had delivered a crippling blow at Adrianople, but they were just one of many tribes massing along Rome's borders. The Vandals, Saxons, and Franks, names that would soon be seared into the Roman psyche, were also growing restless, probing for weaknesses in the empire's defences. These Germanic tribes had long been thorns in Rome's side. For centuries, the Romans had tried to pacify them with a carrot and stick approach, sometimes trading with them, other times fighting to push them back beyond the Rhine and Danube rivers. But like a rising tide, the pressure from these tribes kept building, and the overstretched Roman legions simply couldn't be everywhere at once. It didn't help matters that Rome was distracted by threats on other fronts. In the east, the Persian Sassanid Empire remained a constant adversary, forcing Rome to split its military might. And in the late 300s AD, a fierce new power burst onto the scene from the steppes of Central Asia, the Huns. These fearsome nomadic warriors, known for their superb horsemanship and deadly accuracy with the composite bow, began pushing westward, displacing other tribes in their wake. The Huns didn't directly attack Rome at first, but their migrations set off a domino effect, forcing more and more Germanic peoples up against Rome's borders. The rising pressure finally burst the dam in 406 AD. That bitterly cold winter, the Rhine River froze over, and when spring came, the ice breakup destroyed Roman fortifications along the riverbank. Tens of thousands of Germanic tribesmen, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi poured across the Rhine en masse, fanning out across the Roman province of Gaul. The Western Empire, already teetering, would never fully recover from this blow. More dominoes soon fell. In 410, the unthinkable happened. The Visigoths, led by their cunning king Alaric, laid siege to Rome itself. For the first time in nearly 800 years, barbarians breached the walls of the mighty capital. The sack of Rome sent shockwaves through the empire and marked a grim psychological turning point. If Rome wasn't safe, nowhere was. But the Eternal City's humiliation was just beginning. In 455, the Vandals, who had carved out a kingdom in North Africa, came calling. Led by their fearsome king Genseric, the Vandals stormed ashore at Ostia and spent 2 weeks methodically stripping Rome of its riches. Priceless jewels, gold and silver plate, even the gilded bronze tiles from the Temple of Jupiter, all of it was carted away to adorn Genseric's palaces in Carthage. The term vandalism stems from the memory of their pitiless plundering. The Vandals' conquest of North Africa was especially devastating to the Western Empire. For centuries, the fertile plains of modern-day Tunisia and Algeria had served as the breadbasket for Rome's teeming masses. The region supplied vital grain shipments that kept the capital fed and content. With that territory lost and the shipping lanes under Vandal control, Rome struggled to fill its granaries. Hunger joined fear as the constant companions of the once proud Romans. Beset by external invasions and internal chaos, Rome's authority crumbled in a piecemeal fashion. Gaul was divided between the Franks, Burgundians, and Visigoths. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes carved up Britain. The Vandals ruled North Africa. The Western emperors clung to Italy, but their position grew ever more precarious. The loss of so much territory meant a steep decline in revenue from taxes, money the empire desperately needed to pay its soldiers and fund its operations. In an effort to make ends meet, Roman mints debased the currency, cutting the silver content of coins. But this only triggered crippling inflation, further eroding public confidence. With its economy in shambles, borders overrun, and the mirage of invincibility irreparably shattered, the Western Roman Empire was a hollowed-out husk of its former self by the late 400s AD. All it would take was one final gust of wind to topple this creaking relic, and that breeze was already blowing in from the east, ruffling the golden banners of the Huns as their most famous leader set his sights on Rome. His name still evokes dread even today. Attila, the Scourge of God. Born into a ruling clan of the Huns, Attila rose to power in the early 400s alongside his brother Bleda. For a time, the siblings shared the kingship, extracting a fortune in tribute from a weakened Eastern Roman Empire. But Attila wasn't content to share power or wealth. In 445, he murdered his brother and assumed sole command of the Hunnic war machine. Now the undisputed lord of the steppes, Attila launched a series of blistering raids and conquests that pushed the boundaries of his empire from the Caspian Sea all the way to the Rhine. A skilled commander and a master of psychological warfare, Attila used terror as a weapon. The speed and savagery of his attacks left a trail of dread in his wake. Where Attila has passed, it was said, the grass never grows again. In 452, this horde of nomadic cavalry, maybe 500,000 strong, rolled across the Alps and poured into Italy on a collision course with Rome. As Attila laid waste to the Po Valley, the Western Emperor Valentinian III could only watch helplessly from his refuge in Ravenna. With his Vandal foes controlling the seas and his borders stripped of legions, Valentinian was powerless to stop the Huns' advance. But fate intervened at the gates of Rome. According to legend, Pope Leo I himself met Attila and persuaded him to spare the city. The more likely reason for Attila's retreat was an outbreak of disease within his army and trouble stirring on his eastern frontiers. Whatever the cause, the Huns withdrew, but not before Attila extracted a promise of marriage to Valentinian's sister Honoria and a hefty dowry. It seems the mighty Roman emperor had been reduced to paying off a barbarian king. Attila didn't have long to savor his triumph. In 453, shortly after adding another young bride to his harem, the Hunnic ruler suffered a fatal nosebleed on his wedding night. He choked to death in a stupor, an ignoble end for a man who had been the terror of empires. With Attila's death, the Hunnic threat quickly receded. His sons squabbled over the succession, and the Hun's vassals asserted their independence, splintering the tribal confederation. But by this point, the damage to Rome was already done. The Western Empire was a rump state, its emperor a figurehead, its once proud army a patchwork of barbarian mercenaries. The last emperor to rule the West, fittingly enough, was named Romulus Augustulus, echoing both the founder of Rome and the first Roman emperor. But the similarities ended there. Romulus Augustulus was little more than a puppet ruler, a pawn in the power struggles of barbarian warlords. His father Orestes, a former secretary to Attila, had seized control of the imperial government in 475 AD. To appease his barbarian troops, Orestes promised them land grants in Italy. But the Western Empire had precious little land left to give. When Orestes reneged on his pledge, the simmering anger boiled over into open revolt. The Germanic mercenaries rallied behind one of their own, a chieftain named Odoacer. In 476, Odoacer's forces captured and executed Orestes, then marched on Ravenna. There they found the teenage Emperor Romulus trembling in his palace. In a final humiliation, Odoacer stripped the imperial insignia from the boy ruler and bundled him off to a comfortable exile in Campania. The Western Roman Empire had breathed its last. The fall sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean world. The Eastern Roman Empire, the half of the empire that had long looked down on their Latin cousins, now stood alone against the tide of history. In a symbolic move, the Eastern Emperor Zeno abolished the title of Western Emperor, proclaiming himself sole ruler of a united Roman world, even as that world crumbled around him. Yet in a strange twist, even the barbarians who had brought down the Western Empire seemed awed by the majesty of Rome. Many of them continued to mint coins bearing the emperor's likenesses and rule in the emperor's names, even if that rule was but a pale shadow of imperial glory. The light of Rome, it seemed, could not be fully extinguished. The empire left a deep and lasting imprint on the European mind. Its language, Latin, remained the tongue of learning and liturgy for centuries. Its legal code laid the foundation for civil law across the continent. Its literature, philosophy, and art set standards that endured for a millennium and more. Even the city of Rome itself, ravaged and depopulated, cloaked itself in the mystique of past glory. As Europe descended into the Dark Ages, scholars and chroniclers looked back with awe and longing at the vanished splendor of the eternal city. In time, a Western Roman emperor would arise again, this time wearing the crown of a Germanic monarchy that traced its roots to the conquests of Charlemagne. The Holy Roman Empire, as it came to be known, was a conscious attempt to resurrect the glories of Rome, even if it was, as Voltaire quipped, neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. For 1,000 years and more, Rome's shadow stretched long across the West, even as the East carried the torch in the form of the Byzantine Empire. Centered on Constantine's glittering capital of Constantinople, the Byzantines, who defiantly called themselves Romans, preserved the art, literature, and statecraft of Greco-Roman civilization for centuries after the fall of the Western Empire. The glittering mosaics of Hagia Sophia, the golden treasures of Byzantine icon painting, the intricate court rituals of the emperors, all of these carried echoes of the grandeur that was Rome. Even after the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the dream of a revived Roman Empire haunted the rulers and thinkers of Europe. The Russian Tsars proclaimed Moscow the Third Rome, taking on the mantle of the Byzantine emperors. The British liked to imagine themselves as the New Rome, a globe-spanning empire of law and civilization. Mussolini, that would be Caesar, trumpeted the glories of ancient Rome as he sought to restore Italy to greatness. And in the marbled halls of Washington, D.C., a young republic consciously modeled itself on the checks and balances of Republican Rome. even as it grappled with the challenges of empire. In the end, though, perhaps the true legacy of Rome lies not in its military conquests or its imperial splendor, but in the cautionary tale of its decline, a stark reminder of the dangers of corruption, overreach, and the slow rot of civic decay. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not the result of any single catastrophe, but a long, slow unraveling, a death by 1,000 cuts. The tale is a sobering one for any society that has grown complacent or overconfident in its own greatness. Even the mightiest of empires, Rome reminds us, can crumble if they lose touch with the virtues and values that made them great. As we've seen, the seeds of Rome's demise were planted early, in the growing decadence and corruption of its elite, in the widening gap between rich and poor, in the slow erosion of traditional values and institutions. These internal weaknesses left Rome brittle and vulnerable to external shocks. The military crises of the 3rd century, the barbarian invasions of the 4th and 5th. By the time the Visigoths came knocking at the gates, Rome was already a hollow giant, its legions depleted, its bureaucracy bloated, its economy stretched thin. The fall, when it came, was less a sudden catastrophe than the final toppling of a rotted tree. There is a temptation, in looking back at the fall of Rome, to draw facile comparisons to our own time, to see in our own social divisions and political dysfunctions the same seeds of decline. And indeed, the Roman story does hold enduring lessons for any society. Lessons about the importance of good governance, social cohesion, and a shared sense of civic purpose. But perhaps the deeper lesson of Rome is the reminder that all things pass, that the mightiest empires and the most glittering civilizations are, in the long run, as ephemeral as the morning dew. Sic transit gloria mundi, thus passes the glory of the world. And yet, even in its passing, Rome left an indelible mark on the world, one that endures to this day in our language, our law, our art, and architecture. The eternal city may have fallen, but its legacy lives on, a ghost that still whispers to us across the centuries. So let us give Rome its due, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a towering achievement of the human spirit. For nearly 1,000 years, this remarkable civilization brought law, learning, and a measure of unity to a vast swath of the globe. It gave us the Pantheon and the Colosseum, the poetry of Virgil and the philosophy of Cicero, the grandeur of Julius Caesar and the piety of Gregory the Great. It was, in every sense of the word, a monumental achievement. And though its fall was slow and painful, there is a certain poignancy in the way Rome met its end, with a young emperor named for the founder of the city, with barbarian kings ruling in the shadow of emperors, with the Senate still meeting, even as the city crumbled around it. To the very end, Rome clung to its ancient forms and traditions, a last lingering echo of a world that had passed away. As we come to the end of our journey through the decline and fall of Rome, we are left not just with a sense of melancholy, but with a profound appreciation for the sweep of history, for the way that even the mightiest empires rise and fall like the tides. Rome's story reminds us of the fragility of human achievement, but also of its enduring power to inspire and awe. So let us bid farewell to Rome, not in sorrow, but in gratitude for all that it gave us. And let us carry with us always the memory of this once great civilization, a shining city on a hill whose light still illuminates the world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the ages. Sweet dreams. As Constantine's sons squabbled over their inheritance, the empire's enemies grew bolder. The Sassanid Persians in the east, under their formidable King Shapur II, launched invasions into Roman Mesopotamia and Armenia. Shapur had ascended to the Persian throne as an infant and would rule for a staggering 70 years. During his long reign, he waged near constant war against Rome in a bid to reclaim lost territories. the Romans faced an even graver threat along their northern frontiers. For centuries, Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Saxons had clashed with Rome's legions along the Rhine and Danube rivers. The Romans saw these tribal warriors as uncivilized barbarians. But to the Germanic peoples, the wealthy Roman provinces were a tempting target for plunder and conquest. As pressure on the frontiers intensified, a sudden shockwave rippled across Europe and the Near East. Around the year 370 AD, a fierce nomadic people called the Huns began moving westward from their homeland in Central Asia. The Huns were expert horsemen and ruthless warriors. Their arrival sparked a domino effect, as tribes like the Goths fled across the Danube, seeking refuge inside the Roman Empire. At first, the Romans tried to accommodate the newcomers, but tensions soon boiled over. In 378, the Eastern Emperor Valens met Gothic forces in battle near the city of Adrianople. It would prove to be one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. Valens, underestimating his foe, rashly attacked before Western reinforcements could arrive. Arrows rained down on the legions as they advanced across the plain. Valens himself was slain as the imperial army was enveloped and crushed. Rome had lost an emperor, 2/3 of its eastern army, and any remaining veneer of invincibility. The Battle of Adrianople marked a grim turning point. Rome's military aura was shattered, and the Goths, though unable to seize the eastern capital Constantinople, could now roam and pillage the Balkan provinces at will. More tribes poured across the frontiers, drawn by the scent of Roman weakness. In 406, Alans, Vandals, and Suebi poured across the frozen Rhine into Gaul. 3 years later, Alaric, king of the Visigoths, descended on Italy itself and laid siege to Rome. The Eternal City had not faced a foreign army at its gates for centuries. The shock was palpable as Alaric's Goths surrounded the capital. The Senate hastily assembled a ransom payment of gold, silver, silk, and pepper. Alaric withdrew, but an imperial assassination plot soured any chance of lasting peace. In August of 410, the unthinkable happened. Alaric's forces entered Rome and subjected the capital to 3 days of looting and destruction. Though the sack was restrained by the standards of the time, Alaric, an Arian Christian, forbade the desecration of churches. The blow to Roman power and prestige was shattering. Saint Jerome, the great Christian scholar, lamented that the bright light of all the world was put out. The locus of power was shifting inexorably to the new eastern capital of Constantinople. But the shocks kept coming for the Western Empire. In 429, the Vandals, led by their king Genseric, crossed from Spain into North Africa. With shocking ease, they seized Carthage, Rome's breadbasket. The loss of Africa's vital grain shipments was a logistical and economic disaster for Italy. The Western Empire was now a hollow shell of its former might, shorn of revenues and territory. A grim parade of child emperors and military strongmen cycled through the palace, unable to reverse the empire's accelerating decay. The Vandals sacked a helpless Rome again in 455, and the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the German warlord Odoacer in 476. The Western Roman Empire had passed into history, though the Eastern Empire would endure as the Byzantine Empire for nearly another 1,000 years. Some see the fall of Rome as a sudden cataclysm, but it was more a drawn-out unraveling. There was no one cause, but rather a perfect storm of external threats and internal rot that slowly sapped Rome's strength. Invaders breached frontiers that had grown porous through neglect. Armies loyal to generals and Germanic warlords turned on the state. Crippling taxes and rampant inflation, driven by endless wars and devalued currency, wrecked the economy. Corruption and decadence among the elite spawned popular resentment and unrest. the rise of Christianity created vital new social bonds, but also sowed divisions and drained traditional civic participation. The story of Rome's fall is not a simple one, but its lessons echo across history. It is a cautionary tale of how greatness and power are never eternal. Time and again, from Persia to China to the British Empire, dominion has turned to decay when nations overextend, when arrogance and insularity blind them to the seeds of their own demise. Historian Edward Gibbon, in his monumental work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, saw Rome as a grand civilization brought low as much by its own hand as by foreign foes. Yet for all the centuries of bloodshed and turmoil that followed Rome's collapse, the Dark Ages, as they came to be known, the empire's legacy could never be extinguished. The Latin language became the basis for a half-dozen European tongues. The Roman alphabet endures. Christianity and church law, incubated in the empire, spread to encompass Europe and beyond. Rome's heritage of literature, architecture, science, and philosophy infused medieval and modern Western culture. When the Renaissance and Age of Enlightenment dawned, thinkers looked back to Rome's glory for inspiration, however selectively. Rome, the eternal city, may have fallen, but the majesty and influence of the civilization it built, even faded and fractured, stretched on through the ages. In a sense, the Roman Empire never ended. It simply diffused and evolved, woven into the fabric of the world it once dominated. The physical empire died, but its ideas, laws, and cultural DNA survived to be remixed and reborn, shaping new nations and peoples. Rome's story is one of decline and fall, but also one of a deathless legacy. The closest history has yet come to an eternal empire. As we've seen, the captured Emperor Valerian served as a living symbol of Rome's humiliation and waning power. His son Gallienus took the throne, but was hard-pressed to hold the empire together. The next decade saw the rise of a dizzying array of usurpers and splinter states, all vying for a piece of Roman glory. The average reign of an emperor in this chaotic period lasted only 2 to 3 years before ending in assassination or ignoble death on the battlefield. With such instability at the top, it's no wonder the empire was coming apart at the seams. The Gallic Empire broke away in the west, controlling Britain and parts of Gaul and Spain. In the east, the glittering Palmyrene Empire seized Rome's rich oriental provinces under their ambitious queen Zenobia. It fell to Emperor Aurelian, rising from humble origins in the legions to put the shattered realm back together again. Through skill, tenacity, and sheer force of will, Aurelian defeated the breakaway empires and battled barbarian hordes to restore a fragile unity. For his efforts, the exhausted emperor was hailed as a restituta orbis, restorer of the world. But no sooner had Aurelian secured the frontiers than he fell to assassins in a military conspiracy. Such was the all-too-common fate of soldier emperors in this time of unrest. The late 3rd century saw a dizzying succession of rulers, many meeting a brutal and untimely end mere months after donning the imperial purple. The empire limped on for a few more decades, but its prestige was badly damaged, and cracks in the foundation could no longer be ignored. Reform was desperately needed to save Rome from dissolution. That task would fall on the capable shoulders of a general named Diocletian. Diocletian's reign marked a new chapter in the story of Rome's long decline. Coming to power in 284 AD, he was a military man through and through. The son of former slaves, Diocletian had risen through the ranks by virtue of his wits and leadership. He knew the empire could scarcely survive more power struggles between rival generals. To address this, Diocletian took a gamble and split the empire in two. He would rule the eastern half, while entrusting the west to a co-emperor, Maximian. Each emperor would in turn have a junior partner called a Caesar forming a four-way power-sharing system known as the Tetrarchy. The idea was to establish clear lines of succession and maintain stability. Diocletian didn't stop there in his reforms. He subdivided provinces into smaller, more manageable units and greatly expanded the imperial bureaucracy. More governors and tax officials meant the emperor's eyes and ears were everywhere. Of course, this also meant a heavier tax burden, which didn't exactly endear Diocletian to the common people. In a futile attempt to curb inflation, Diocletian issued his famous edict on maximum prices in 301. This sweeping law set price caps on over 1,000 goods and services, from a measure of wheat to a lawyer's fee. Severe penalties were imposed on merchants who exceeded the limits. But like most attempts at price controls, the edict backfired and was widely ignored. Diocletian saw threats to the empire from within as well as without. To him, the rising popularity of Christianity posed a direct challenge to the divine authority of the emperors. In 303, he launched the last and bloodiest persecution of Christians in Roman history. Churches were razed, scriptures burned, and the faithful forced to sacrifice to the old gods on pain of death. Despite these efforts, Diocletian's reforms ultimately failed to stop Rome's slow unraveling. When the aging emperor retired in 305 and the tetrarchs fell to squabbling without him, it was clear a firmer hand was still needed. The ambitious son of one of the tetrarchs, Constantine, was waiting in the wings to fill that void. The reign of Constantine the Great marked a true turning point in Roman history. Coming to power after a series of civil wars, Constantine would change the face of the empire forever. His most pivotal moment came on the eve of a battle against his rival Maxentius in 312. If we believe the famous tale, Constantine saw a vision of a cross in the sky, along with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Interpreting this as a sign of divine favor, Constantine rode out to victory under the banner of Christ. The following year, he issued the Edict of Milan, which granted religious tolerance and effectively legalized Christianity in the empire. This was a momentous shift, as the once persecuted faith now enjoyed imperial support. But perhaps Constantine's most visible legacy was the construction of a glorious new capital that would bear his name, Constantinople. Situated on the Bosphorus Strait, this new Rome was dedicated in 330 AD. With its strategic location and heavily fortified walls, Constantinople would go on to be the beating heart of the empire long after the fall of Rome itself. When Constantine died in 337, the empire was split between his squabbling sons. Never again would the realm be truly reunited. As imperial authority fractured, the groundwork was laid for Rome's final act. All the while, the rising tide of Christianity swept through society, gradually supplanting the pagan traditions that had sustained Rome for centuries. As the 4th century drew to a close, the Roman Empire was but a shadow of its former might. The majestic Pax Romana had given way to an uncertain age, as the increasingly divided realm faced threats from all sides. Barbarian tribes that had long been held at bay gathered like storm clouds on the horizon. The Goths, Vandals, Franks and other Germanic peoples had traded and warred with Rome for centuries. Often they were allowed to settle inside Roman territory in exchange for military service. But as imperial power weakened, these arrangements became strained. Ominous rumblings of discontent could be heard in the forests beyond the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The delicate balance was upset by the sudden appearance of the Huns, fierce nomadic warriors from the steppes of Central Asia. United under their ambitious king Attila, the Huns cut a bloody swath across Europe, sending Gothic refugees fleeing into Roman lands. The Visigoths were welcomed into the empire in 376, but soon rose up against their hosts. This Gothic revolt culminated in the disastrous Battle of Adrianople in 378. Valens, emperor of the Eastern Empire, rashly tried to crush the Goths without waiting for reinforcements. Instead, the overconfident emperor found himself outflanked and encircled on the battlefield. Valens himself was killed, along with 2/3 of his army. It was the most shattering defeat Rome had suffered since Hannibal's victory at Cannae over 6 centuries earlier. The shocking slaughter at Adrianople was a sign of things to come. A few decades later, the Goths came knocking at the gates of Rome itself. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, had once fought as an ally of the Romans, but promises of land and tribute went unfulfilled, leading Alaric to turn on his erstwhile masters. Alaric's forces sacked Rome in 410 AD, the first time the city had fallen to a foreign foe in nearly 800 years. The Eternal City was so synonymous with the Roman state that many saw this calamity as a sign of the empire's impending doom. As the great Christian thinker Saint Jerome lamented, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" Rome's prestige was shattered, but the material losses were even more ruinous. The sack of 410 was followed by an even deadlier blow, as the Vandals seized Rome's breadbasket of North Africa in 429. The city that once fed an empire now struggled to sustain itself, dependent on a trickle of grain from Egypt. With its territories gutted, the Western Empire saw its revenues shrivel. There was simply not enough gold in the imperial coffers to fund the legions and lavish building projects of old. Nor could Rome rely on the old model of military recruitment, as the sturdy farmer soldiers of Italy had long since vanished, their lands swallowed up by sprawling estates. Instead, the tattered empire came to rely ever more on foreign mercenaries, hiring Goths, Huns, and others to fight their battles. These unruly barbarian soldiers often proved to be a double-edged sword, as likely to turn on their Roman employers as defend them. By the late 5th century, this unhappy arrangement would spell the end of an empire. The final anticlimactic act of the Western Roman Empire came in 476 AD. The last emperor was the unfortunately named Romulus Augustulus, a mere teenager when he took the throne. Though of the famed genes Julia, this Romulus held only a faint echo of the power of Rome's legendary founder. Real authority lay with Romulus's father Orestes, a general and diplomat of Germanic descent. When Orestes denied the barbarian mercenaries' demands for land, their leader Odoacer rose in revolt. Orestes was swiftly captured and executed. His hapless son was forced to abdicate. The discarded emperor shuffled off to a monastery. For his part, Odoacer saw no need to prop up the facade of the Western Empire any longer. He returned the imperial regalia to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople and simply proclaimed himself King of Italy. After limping along for decades, the once indomitable Roman state had finally expired with a pitiful whimper. Of course, the Eastern Empire would endure as the Byzantine Empire for nearly 1,000 years more, until the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The Byzantines never stopped thinking of themselves as Romans, the unbroken successors to the realm of Augustus and Trajan. But the sunset of the Western Empire marked the end of an era. The fall of Rome was not the work of any one man nor any single cause. Instead, it was death by 1,000 cuts, a perfect storm of external threats and inner decay. At its root was a slow but profound transformation in the social fabric of Rome itself, as the republic of yeoman farmers and land-owning aristocrats gave way to a top-heavy edifice of imperial pomp and a permanent underclass on the dole. Long wars of conquest gave Rome an empire, but sustaining those sprawling territories and borders proved too tall an order. Expansion brought slaves, plunder, and tribute flowing into Roman coffers for a time, but it also planted the seeds of the empire's undoing. As the empire grew, so too did the costs of garrisoning its far-flung frontiers. A swollen military came to dominate political life, leading to an epidemic of coups and civil wars. Power passed from the Senate to the barracks, and then became a lethal prize for any general with sufficient ambition and a loyal army at his back. Maintaining internal order came at the expense of outward dynamism, as a vibrant society ossified into a brittle, autocratic regime. In the apt words of the historian Tacitus, as the empire expanded, they made a desert and called it peace. That desert proved fertile ground for the rise of Christianity, a faith that offered spiritual comfort and eternal salvation to inhabitants of an uncertain realm. Sapped of strength within, Rome eventually yielded to pressure from the barbarian peoples it had long held at bay. Waves of migration, spurred by the relentless expansion of the Huns, crashed against the empire's borders until they could no longer hold. In the end, the fall came not with a bang, but a slow, gasping slide into the shadows of history. There is a sobering lesson in the story of Rome's decline, that no empire, no matter how mighty, is immune to the march of time. Even a realm as vast and formidable as Rome can be undone by a confluence of forces, some dramatic, others scarcely noticed in the moment. Yet Rome's legacy endured long after the fall of the Caesars. Its language, laws, and customs became the cultural DNA of medieval and modern Europe. The very idea of Rome, of an eternal city shining as a beacon of civilization, retained a powerful hold on the imagination of the West. In the centuries to come, popes and emperors would wrap themselves in the mantle of Rome's vanished glory. For what was the Holy Roman Empire if not an elegy to its namesake, an attempt to resurrect the majesty of the Caesars in new garb? The Renaissance, too, was an attempt to recapture the grandeur of the classical past, to draw on the wisdom of the ancients in forging a new age. Perhaps the true measure of a civilization is not how long it endures, but what it leaves behind. In this sense, Rome's greatness was never truly extinguished. It lived on in the soaring arches of medieval cathedrals, in the stately columns of Enlightenment halls, in the very fabric of our political and cultural institutions. Rome's end was long, messy, and anticlimactic, ground down by centuries of strife and misfortune. But its echoes still resound through the ages, an immortal empire of the mind. For as long as we remember the eternal city, Rome will never truly fall. Diocletian's reforms did bring some measure of stability and security back to the empire, at least for a time, but they also came at a cost. His strict control of the economy, with wage and price fixing, stifled trade and innovation. The bureaucracy became bloated and corrupt, and the increased pressure on average Romans to foot the bill for Diocletian's expanded military only bred further resentment. Even Diocletian himself seemed to recognize the limits of what one man, however powerful, could do to stem the empire's decline. In a move virtually unprecedented for a Roman emperor, Diocletian voluntarily retired in the year 305 AD. He left the imperial throne and retired to his palace on the Dalmatian coast to raise cabbages. But without the force of Diocletian's iron will holding it together, the tetrarchy soon crumbled. His co-emperor Maximian refused to retire and tried to regain power. The two deputy emperors, Galerius and Constantius, began jockeying for control, and waiting in the wings was Constantius's ambitious son Constantine, who would soon rise to reunite the empire under his own banner. The young Constantine had spent years as a virtual hostage at Diocletian's court, watching and learning from the old emperor. When his father Constantius died in Britain in 306, Constantine was proclaimed emperor by his troops, but he still had to contend with the other tetrarchs, Maximian's son Maxentius, who ruled Italy, and Galerius's successor Licinius, who held sway in the east. What followed was a series of bitter power struggles and civil wars as the empire again turned on itself. In 312 AD, Constantine marched on Rome to confront Maxentius. On the eve of the decisive Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine reportedly had a divine vision. He saw the sign of the cross in the sky and heard the words, "In this sign you shall conquer." Placing the Christian symbol on his soldiers' shields, Constantine triumphed over Maxentius, who drowned in the Tiber River as his army was routed. Constantine entered Rome victorious, and one of his first acts was to legalize Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. This marked a major turning point, as the once persecuted faith now enjoyed imperial favor. Constantine then turned his attention to Licinius in the east. After a few initial skirmishes, the two teamed up to issue the Edict of Milan and govern their respective halves of the empire. But peace between the co-emperors would not last. In 324, Constantine defeated Licinius in battle, executing him and his son the next year. Constantine now stood alone as master of the entire Roman world. He marked this triumph by founding a new capital, Constantinople, the New Rome, on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium in 330 AD. Built on a strategic choke point between Europe and Asia, the city was adorned with forums, palaces, hippodromes and churches to rival the old Rome. It soon became the thriving metropolis of the Eastern Empire. Meanwhile, the old pagan traditions were in decline, as Constantine showered patronage on the church. He built grand basilicas like Old Saint, Peter's in Rome, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He intervened in church councils to help formulate Christian doctrine, and while he himself waited to be baptized until his deathbed, he set the empire on a course to become a fully Christian state. But even as he worked to solidify the empire, cracks continued to show. Constantine executed his eldest son Crispus and wife Fausta for unclear reasons in 326. And his three surviving sons were eager to claim power after his death. When Constantine died in 337, he was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, but he left the empire divided once more between his quarrelsome heirs. The Constantinian dynasty would continue to rule the Roman world for a few more decades, but it was increasingly a house divided. Constantine's sons, Constantine II, Constantius II and Constans, fought each other in a series of destructive civil wars. By 350 AD, Constantius II emerged as sole ruler after his brothers died in battle. But Constantius II soon faced another threat from within his own family. In 355, he appointed his cousin Julian as Caesar, or deputy emperor, and sent him to Gaul to guard the Rhine frontier. Julian won a string of surprising victories against Germanic invaders and became a hero to his soldiers. In 360, they proclaimed him Augustus, or ruling emperor, against Constantius's wishes. Constantius died before the two could face each other in battle, however, and Julian became sole emperor. But his reign would be short and transformative. Raised a Christian, Julian rejected the faith and tried to revive paganism, earning him the moniker Julian the Apostate. He purged Christians from imperial administration and launched an ambitious military campaign against Rome's old enemy, Persia. But Julian was mortally wounded in battle in 363 and died without an heir. The empire was thrown back into chaos. Over the next several decades, emperors came and went in rapid succession as rival generals battled for supremacy. The frontiers crumbled under increasing barbarian encroachments, and the great cultural and religious transformation set in motion by Constantine continued to unfold. Christianity gained more and more ground at the expense of the old gods. In 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius I made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Pagan temples and rituals were now banned instead of simply discouraged. classical learning and literature were increasingly seen through a Christian lens. Meanwhile, the Germanic tribes that had long been held at bay continued to hammer at the gates of the empire. Rome had tried for centuries to pacify and assimilate these barbarians, settling them within imperial borders as so-called federates in exchange for peace and military service. But it was an uneasy arrangement, as the Romans looked down on the Germans as uncouth savages, and the Germans envied Roman wealth and power. The pressure kept building as the 4th century drew to a close. In the frigid winter of 406 AD, the Rhine River froze solid, and tens of thousands of barbarians poured across the icy span and into the empire's heartland. Gaul was overrun by Alans, Sueves, and Vandals. The Romano-British were left to fend for themselves as the imperial government withdrew troops to face the crisis. Italy itself was sacked by the Visigoths under their king Alaric in 410 AD, the first time outsiders had breached the walls of Rome in 800 years. The sackings and invasions sent shockwaves through the empire, and a sense of impending doom gripped many Romans. The great Christian theologian Saint Jerome, who witnessed the Visigoths' depredations firsthand, lamented, "The bright light of all the world was put out, the Roman Empire was decapitated, and, to speak more correctly, the whole world perished in one city." The mighty Roman legions, which had guarded the frontiers for so long, were a shadow of their former selves, weakened by decades of infighting and undersupplied by a crumbling economy. Barbarian mercenaries now made up a large part of the army, as Rome struggled to find enough native-born recruits. These mercenaries were often more loyal to their tribal leaders than to the emperor. Nowhere was this clearer than in the figure of Flavius Stilicho, a half-Vandal general who became the power behind the throne in the Western Empire in the early 400s AD. Stilicho beat back several barbarian invasions and was effectively ruling the West on behalf of the young Emperor Honorius. But his enemies at court convinced Honorius that Stilicho was plotting to seize power. Honorius had Stilicho executed in 408 AD, a decision that left the West without a strong defender. As the 400s rolled on, the Western Empire slipped further into anarchy and decay. Effective control was reduced to Italy and parts of Gaul and Spain. Emperors in Ravenna became little more than figureheads, while barbarian strongmen jockeyed for power. The Vandals seized North Africa in the 430s, cutting Rome off from the vital grain supplies it needed to feed its population. The loss of Africa's tax revenues was another nail in the coffin of the Western Empire. The line of Western emperors staggered on for a few more decades, until a final inglorious end. In 475 AD, a general named Orestes staged a palace coup and installed his teenage son Romulus as a puppet emperor. The boy ruler would be mockingly nicknamed Romulus Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus. But Orestes had made a crucial mistake. His army was made up mostly of Germanic mercenaries, including Heruli, Scyrians, and Rugians. They demanded that Orestes grant them lands in Italy as payment for their service. When he refused, they mutinied under the leadership of a Germanic general named Odoacer. Odoacer's forces easily captured the imperial capital of Ravenna. Orestes was executed, and young Romulus Augustulus was forced to abdicate. According to some accounts, Odoacer took pity on the boy and spared his life, giving him a pension and sending him to live with relatives in southern Italy. With no use for an emperor, Odoacer sent the imperial regalia back to Constantinople and proclaimed himself King of Italy. For all intents and purposes, the Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist. The date was September 4th, 476 AD, a date often cited as the fall of the Roman Empire. But in truth, there was no single dramatic event that ended the empire. It had been crumbling away slowly for decades, if not centuries. The sack of Rome in 410, the loss of Africa in the 430s, the disappearance of an effective central government, all were stages in a long, drawn-out process of decline and dissolution. And while 476 AD marked the end of an emperor in the Western Empire, the Eastern Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, would continue on for nearly 1,000 years more, until the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Even then, the Byzantines still proudly called themselves Romans. The story of Rome's fall is a complex one, with no simple answers. Over the course of this series, we've explored some of the key factors that contributed to the decline, from political instability and economic woes to military threats and shifting cultural currents. But perhaps the most important lesson is that empires, no matter how mighty they seem, are ultimately fragile things. The philosopher Edward Gibbon, in his classic work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, put it eloquently when he wrote, "The decline of Rome was the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness. Prosperity ripened the principle of decay. The causes of destruction multiplied with the extent of conquest, and as soon as time or accident had removed the artificial supports, the stupendous fabric yielded to the pressure of its own weight." In other words, the very things that made Rome great, its vast size, its wealth, its diversity, also made it vulnerable. The empire grew too large to govern effectively, its economy too unequal to sustain. The incorporation of so many different peoples and cultures into the Roman system, while admirable in its cosmopolitanism, also made it harder to maintain a sense of unity and common purpose. Rome, in the end, was a victim of its own success. The weight of empire proved too much to bear. But its legacy would live on long after the last emperor left his throne. The Byzantines would carry forward Roman traditions in the East for centuries to come. The barbarian kingdoms of the West, while dismantling Roman institutions, would also assimilate much of Roman culture, religion, and law. And the idea of Rome, of a universal empire uniting far-flung peoples under a single banner, would continue to inspire would-be conquerors from Charlemagne to Napoleon. The founding fathers of the United States would consciously model their new republic on Rome, right down to the architecture of the Capitol building. So while the Roman Empire itself might have fallen, its ghost lingered on and continues to haunt us to this day. Its triumphs and tragedies still have much to teach us about the nature of power, the march of history, and the rise and fall of the world's great civilizations. The story of Rome is in many ways the story of human civilization itself, with all its glory and grandeur, but also its flaws and frailties. It's a story that contains multitudes, one that can never be exhausted or fully told. But I hope that this series has at least offered a glimpse into the epic sweep and enduring fascination of Roman history. The empire that once stretched from the moors of Scotland to the sands of the Sahara, from the shores of the Atlantic to the banks of the Euphrates, may be gone. The Forum where Cicero and Caesar walked is now a ruin. The Colosseum where gladiators fought and died is a tourist attraction. The Pantheon, where the gods of Rome were once worshipped, now houses the tombs of Italian kings. But something of Rome still survives, and always will, as long as people study its history and contemplate the lessons of its rise and fall. The Eternal City may no longer rule the world, but it will always loom large in the imagination. Because the story of Rome is ultimately a mirror for the human condition itself, reflecting our noblest aspirations and our darkest fears, our highest triumphs and our deepest tragedies. And that is why, even after all these centuries, it still has the power to move us, to fascinate us, and to keep us pondering its mysteries as we wander, in dreams or in waking life, among the glorious ruins it left behind. As the crisis of the 3rd century finally subsided and Diocletian's reforms brought a measure of stability back to the empire, a new figure arose who would change the course of Roman history forever. His name was Constantine, and his reign marked a pivotal turning point for Rome in more ways than one. Born in the city of Naissus in present-day Serbia, Constantine was the son of one of Diocletian's co-emperors, Constantius Chlorus. From a young age, Constantine showed the ambition and military prowess that would serve him well in his quest for power. He fought alongside his father in campaigns against the Picts in Britain and quickly rose through the ranks of the army. But it was in the year 312 AD that Constantine's life and the fate of Rome would be forever altered. As he prepared to face off against his rival Maxentius for control of the Western Empire, Constantine reportedly had a divine vision. On the eve of the Battle of Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome, he looked up to the sky and saw a cross of light above the sun, along with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Taking this as a sign from the Christian God, Constantine ordered his troops to paint the symbol of the cross on their shields before marching into battle. Against all odds, Constantine's army emerged victorious, and he rode triumphantly into Rome as the undisputed ruler of the West. But the Battle of Milvian Bridge was just the beginning of Constantine's incredible story. Over the next few years, he would consolidate his power and introduce sweeping changes that would leave a lasting mark on the Roman world. Perhaps his most significant act came in the year 313, when he issued the Edict of Milan. This groundbreaking decree granted religious tolerance throughout the empire and effectively legalized Christianity, which had previously been outlawed and persecuted under Roman rule. The Edict of Milan put an end to centuries of oppression for early Christians and paved the way for the religion's rapid spread in the years to come. Constantine himself eventually converted to Christianity, becoming the first Roman emperor to embrace the faith. He took an active role in church affairs, even convening the famous Council of Nicaea in 325 to settle doctrinal disputes among bishops. Under Constantine's patronage, magnificent churches began to spring up across the empire, including the iconic Old Saint, Peter's Basilica in Rome. But Constantine's influence extended far beyond religion. He also enacted major administrative reforms, reorganizing the empire's provincial structure and creating a new, streamlined system of governance. He minted a new gold coin, the solidus, which would remain the standard currency of the Roman world for centuries. Perhaps most famously, in the year 330, Constantine established a new capital for the empire in the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. Renamed Constantinople in his honor, this new Rome would serve as the seat of Roman power in the East for over 1,000 years, long after the fall of the Western Empire. Sadly, Constantine's dream of a united Christian empire would not long survive his death in 337. In a foreshadowing of conflicts to come, his sons fought bitterly over their inheritance, eventually dividing the empire between them. Never again would the Roman world be truly whole. Still, Constantine's legacy loomed large over the centuries that followed. The Christianization of the empire that began under his rule would continue apace, gradually supplanting the old pagan traditions. The city he founded, Constantinople, would endure as a bastion of civilization even as Rome itself crumbled. And the administrative and military reforms he set in motion would shape the course of Roman history for generations. In many ways, the age of Constantine represented the last gasp of a unified Roman Empire. As the 4th century drew to a close, the cracks that had first appeared during the crisis of the 3rd century began to widen into gaping chasms. Barbarian invasions, economic turmoil, and religious strife would soon tear the Roman world apart. But for a few brief decades, Constantine had managed to stitch the fraying empire back together, binding it with the common thread of Christianity. His reign marked a rare moment of clarity in the gathering darkness, a final flicker of light before the long night of Rome's downfall descended. As we'll see, that downfall was still a long way off. The empire would limp on for another century in the West, stubbornly clinging to its fading glory. And in the East, The Byzantine Empire that Constantine had founded would endure for centuries more as the last bastion of Roman civilization. But the forces that would ultimately topple Rome were already gathering beyond its borders. In the forests of Germany and the steppes of Central Asia, the barbarian tribes were growing restless, their hunger for conquest stirring. The Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, names that would soon strike terror into the hearts of Romans, were massing on the fringes of the empire. For now, the legions still held them at bay, beating back their incursions and keeping the frontiers secure. Constantine's walls still girdled Constantinople, and the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, still reigned across much of Europe and the Mediterranean. But the age of the emperors was drawing to a close. The glories of Augustus and Trajan, of Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, were fading into memory. The empire was entering its twilight, and the barbarians were at the gates. As we continue our journey through the tangled thicket of Roman decline, we'll meet the men who fought in vain to hold back the tide, the last heroes of a dying empire. And we'll watch as one by one, the lamps of Roman civilization flicker out until only embers remain amidst the gathering gloom. But first, we must turn our gaze to the frontiers, to the wild borderlands where Rome's doom would ultimately be sealed. For it was there, in the harsh forests of Germany and the windswept plains of the Danube, that the seeds of the empire's destruction were already being sown. The barbarian tribes had long been a thorn in Rome's side, an endless source of conflict and instability along the empire's frontiers. For centuries, Roman generals had fought to subdue them, to bring them under the imperial yoke. And for a time, it had worked. The Pax Romana had extended its reach far beyond Italy, bringing order and prosperity to lands that had once been wild and untamed. But as the empire began to crack under the strain of its own size and complexity, the old certainties began to crumble. The legions that had once seemed invincible now struggled to hold the line against the surging tide of barbarian incursions. The first major blow came in the year 378, at the Battle of Adrianople in present-day Turkey. There, a massive force of Goths, led by a chieftain named Fritigern, annihilated a Roman army and killed the Eastern Emperor Valens. It was a shocking defeat, one that shattered the aura of invincibility that had long surrounded Rome's legions. From then on, the floodgates were open. In 406, a horde of Vandals, Alans, and Sueves poured across the frozen Rhine into Gaul, setting the Western Empire ablaze. The Romans would never regain control of those lost territories. Meanwhile, the Huns were on the march, driving wave after wave of Germanic tribes before them as they moved westward from the steppes of Central Asia. The most famous of these Hunnic leaders was Attila, the so-called Scourge of God, whose armies ravaged the Balkans and Gaul in the 440s and 450s. Rome itself was not immune to the growing chaos. In 410, the unthinkable happened. For the first time in 800 years, the city was sacked by a foreign invader. An army of Visigoths led by a warlord named Alaric breached the walls and plundered the Eternal City for 3 days, shocking the Roman world to its core. But perhaps the most devastating blow of all came a few decades later. In 455, the Vandals, one of the barbarian tribes that had crossed the Rhine half a century earlier, launched an invasion of Italy itself from their newly conquered territories in North Africa. Their king, Gaiseric, led his army on a scorched earth campaign up the peninsula, culminating in a brutal sack of Rome that lasted 2 weeks. The Vandals stripped the city of its riches, carrying off priceless treasures and thousands of captives. They even stripped the gold from the roof of the Temple of Jupiter, a potent symbol of Rome's faded glory. But the material damage paled in comparison to the psychological impact. The Vandal sack marked the beginning of the end for the Western Empire. The emperors who followed were mere puppets, propped up by barbarian warlords who wielded the real power behind the throne. The legions were a shadow of their former selves, unable to protect the empire's crumbling frontiers. Everywhere, the old order was dying. The cities of the West were emptying out as trade collapsed, and the middle class vanished. The great villas of the senatorial elite lay in ruins, their mosaics shattered and their gardens overgrown. In the countryside, the old Roman system of latifundia, vast slave-worked agricultural estates, was breaking down, replaced by a new feudal order centered on local strongmen and their bands of retainers. Amidst all this chaos, the last emperors of the West clung to their thrones, like drowning men grasping at driftwood. But their reigns were short and troubled, marred by coups, assassinations, and barbarian invasions. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. In 476 AD, a warlord named Odoacer deposed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus, sending the imperial regalia back to Constantinople with a message for the Eastern Emperor Zeno. The position of Western Emperor was no longer needed. Italy would henceforth be ruled by kings. And so, with a whimper rather than a bang, the Western Roman Empire came to an end. The great civilization that had dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries had finally succumbed to the rot within and the barbarians at the gates. But in the East, the empire that Constantine had founded endured. For another 1,000 years, the Byzantine emperors would rule from Constantinople, presiding over a flourishing culture that blended Greco-Roman traditions with Orthodox Christianity and the influences of the East. Even as the Western Empire crumbled, the Byzantines continued to build magnificent churches and palaces, to sponsor works of art and literature that would shape European culture for centuries to come. The walls of Constantinople would hold firm against wave after wave of would-be conquerors, from the Arabs to the Avars to the Russians. Not until 1453, when the Ottoman Turks finally breached those ancient ramparts, did the last remnant of the Roman Empire flicker out at last. But by then, the world had moved on. The age of the Romans was long gone, and a new era was dawning, an era of knights and castles, of crusades and cathedrals, of the rise of Islam and the voyages of discovery. And yet, in the shadow of all that followed, the memory of Rome endured. For centuries, European rulers would style themselves as heirs to the Caesars, even as they grappled with the challenges of a rapidly changing world. The ruins of the Forum and the Colosseum would become places of pilgrimage for generations of artists and intellectuals, inspiring works of art and literature that continue to resonate today. In the end, perhaps the true measure of Rome's greatness lies not in the empire's longevity or the vastness of its conquests, but in the enduring power of its legacy. For even as the physical structures of Roman civilization crumbled into dust, the ideas and values that Rome bequeathed to the world, of law and citizenship, of art and literature, of the inherent dignity of the human person, would continue to shape the course of history long after the last emperor had fallen. The story of Rome's downfall is a complex and multifaceted one, a centuries-long saga of war and peace, of glory and decline, of order and chaos. It is a story of great leaders and common soldiers, of barbarian warlords and scheming bureaucrats, of prophets and prelates and ordinary men and women caught up in the sweep of history. But above all, it is a story of the enduring resilience of the human spirit, of the stubborn refusal of men and women to succumb to the tides of fate, even as the world they knew crumbled around them. In the end, the fall of Rome was not just a political or military event, but a human tragedy, a slow-motion cataclysm that unfolded across generations, changing the course of history in ways that would reverberate for centuries to come. And so, As we come to the end of our journey through the tangled thicket of Roman decline, let us pause to reflect on the lessons that this great civilization's downfall may hold for our own time. For even as we marvel at the grandeur and glory of ancient Rome, we must also grapple with the harsh realities of its decline, the corrosive effects of corruption and decadence, the perils of overextension and imperial hubris, the dangers of religious strife and social unrest. In an age of rapid change and global upheaval, these are lessons that we would do well to heed. For as the poet Shelley once wrote, in lines that seem to capture the essence of Rome's enduring legacy, the lone and level sands stretch far away, boundless and bare, and on the pedestal, these words appear: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains." The story of Rome is, in the end, the story of all great civilizations, a story of rise and fall, of triumph and tragedy, of the eternal cycle of creation and destruction that lies at the heart of the human experience. It is a story that continues to resonate down the ages, inviting us to ponder the fragility of even the mightiest empires, and the enduring power of the human spirit to rise from the ashes of defeat. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us dream of Rome, of its glory and its grandeur, its decadence and its decline. Let us dream of the great men and women who shaped its destiny, and of the ordinary people who lived and loved and struggled in its shadow. And let us hold fast to the lessons that this great civilization's story may hold for our own time. Lessons of courage and compassion, of resilience and renewal, of the abiding hope that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit will endure. Good night and pleasant dreams. The Praetorian Guard, originally formed as an elite unit to protect the emperor, had by this point become a powerful political force in its own right. They realized that as the ones with the swords and spears, they could effectively choose who would sit on the imperial throne, and so began a vicious cycle in the 3rd century. An emperor would come to power, only to be deposed or assassinated by the Praetorians when they grew dissatisfied or were swayed by a rival who promised them a better deal. One notorious example was Emperor Pertinax. He had come to power in 193 AD with the blessing of the Praetorian Guard, who had assassinated his predecessor Commodus. But Pertinax quickly lost their favor when he tried to impose stricter military discipline and frugal economic reforms. After a mere 87 days in power, Pertinax was confronted by a group of angry Praetorians. When he tried to reason with them, he was promptly stabbed to death. What happened next almost defies belief. The Praetorians, having just murdered an emperor, decided to auction off the imperial throne to the highest bidder. The winner was a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus, who promised each Praetorian guardsman a whopping 25,000 sesterces, equivalent to several years' salary. Julianus enjoyed a brief reign before being ousted and executed by a rival general just 2 months later. The Praetorians, it seemed, were loyal only to money and their own interests. While the Praetorian Guard wreaked havoc in Rome, the empire faced a different kind of threat on its frontiers. For centuries, skillful diplomacy, strategic alliances, and occasional demonstrations of military might had kept the Germanic tribes at bay. But as the internal chaos of the 3rd century crisis weakened Rome's grip, the barbarians grew more restless and daring in their incursions into imperial territory. The empire had always had an uneasy relationship with the Gothic people who inhabited the region north of the Danube River. They were first mentioned by name in a lost work by the 3rd century historian Cassius Dio, who wrote of a battle in 238 AD, where the Goths slaughtered a force of Roman soldiers and took many captives. But the most shocking blow came in the year 251, when the Goths defeated and killed the Roman Emperor Decius in the Battle of Abritus. Decius had been campaigning against the Goths, trying to push them back from the Danube frontier, but he fell into a trap set by the Gothic king Neva near the town of Abritus in modern-day Bulgaria. The Roman army was surrounded and massacred in the swampy terrain. Decius and his son were among the fallen, becoming the first Roman emperors to ever be killed in battle against a foreign enemy. It was a psychological blow from which the empire would never fully recover. The invincible aura of Rome had been shattered. The humiliation at Abritus was still a fresh wound when, just 9 years later, the unthinkable happened. The Emperor Valerian, who had succeeded Decius, was campaigning against the Persian Empire in the east. In 260 AD, Valerian arranged to meet the Persian king Shapur I to negotiate an end to the conflict, but the meeting was a trap. Valerian was captured and would spend the rest of his life as a prisoner of the Persians, an immense embarrassment for Rome. Shapur, in a form of ancient psychological warfare, was said to have used the captive Valerian as a human footstool when mounting his horse. Upon Valerian's death, his skin was allegedly flayed, stuffed with straw, and preserved as a trophy in a Persian temple. The message was clear. The Romans, for all their military might and aura of invincibility, could be brought low by a cunning adversary. Back in Rome, Valerian's son Gallienus took the imperial throne, but his claim to rule was immediately under threat. With the empire in such a vulnerable state, regional commanders began to break away and proclaim themselves independent rulers. In the east, a province called Palmyra, led by a charismatic queen named Zenobia, declared its independence and seized Egypt and much of Asia Minor. In the west, a general named Postumus established a breakaway regime in Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain, the so-called Gallic Empire. For over a decade, Gallienus struggled to hold the empire together against these secessionist threats, all while beating back further invasions by the Goths and Alemanni along the Danube and Rhine frontiers. By the time he was assassinated by his own troops in 268, the Roman Empire was in very real danger of total collapse. Into this chaotic scene stepped Gallienus's successor, Claudius II, who would come to be known as Claudius Gothicus, Claudius the Conqueror of the Goths. A respected general and capable leader, Claudius won a series of decisive victories over the Goths, including the massive Battle of Naissus in 268 or 269. Though modern historians debate the scale of the battle, with ancient sources claiming wildly inflated casualty figures, there's no doubt it was a badly needed morale boost for the beleaguered Romans. Claudius Gothicus did not have long to savour his triumphs. He fell ill and died of plague in 270. But he was succeeded by another great general, Aurelian, who would finally restore some semblance of order to the empire. Aurelian first dealt with the breakaway regions, reconquering Palmyra and its famous queen in 272. Zenobia was captured and brought back to Rome, where she was paraded in golden chains in Aurelian's triumph, an extravagant victory celebration. With Palmyra subdued, Aurelian turned his attention to the Gallic Empire. In a series of battles, he defeated Postumus's successor Tetricus and reunified the western provinces with the rest of the empire. For the first time in over 15 years, the Roman Empire was once again under the rule of a single emperor. Though Aurelian himself soon fell victim to assassination, the fate of so many soldier emperors in this turbulent era, he had pulled the empire back from the brink of destruction and set the stage for a much-needed period of reform and renewal under Emperor Diocletian. The Aurelian walls of Rome stand as a monument to this precarious time. Aurelian recognized that invasions and civil wars were bringing the threat of attack ever closer to the imperial capital itself. Though Rome had long taken pride in not needing fortifications, that age of confidence was over. The 12-mile circuit of walls, with their imposing gates and defensive towers, underscored that even the Eternal City was no longer invincible. As we've explored, the crisis years of the 3rd century saw Rome brought to its knees by a combination of weak unstable leadership, barbarian incursions, and breakaway territories that challenged the very idea of a unified empire under a single ruler. While Aurelian had stopped the bleeding, the underlying rot remained. It would fall to his successor Diocletian to take the next step, radically reforming the very structure of the empire in a last-ditch effort to save Rome from collapse. When Diocletian took the throne in 284 AD, he faced an empire that was a far cry from the confident, conquering colossus of centuries past. The borders were still under threat, the treasury was depleted, and the imperial throne had become a game of musical chairs, with whoever had the strongest army claiming the title before being dispatched by the next rival in line. Diocletian, who had risen through the ranks of the army himself, understood that tinkering around the edges would no longer suffice. Only a top-to-bottom reform of the imperial system could hope to stave off collapse. At the heart of Diocletian's reforms was the tetrarchy, or rule of four. He recognized that the empire had simply grown too vast and unwieldy to be effectively governed by a single emperor. His solution was to divide power between four co-emperors, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, each responsible for a quarter of the empire. When an Augustus died or retired, his Caesar would be promoted to take his place, and a new Caesar would be appointed. It was, in theory, an orderly system of succession that would put an end to the cycle of civil wars. To further improve efficiency, Diocletian vastly expanded the bureaucracy, creating a complex hierarchy of provincial governors, vicars, and praetorian prefects to manage the day-to-day business of the empire. The number of provinces was nearly doubled, from 48 to 85, to make administration more manageable. Diocletian also sought to address the empire's economic woes with his edict on maximum prices in 301 AD, an attempt to curb rampant inflation by setting price ceilings on goods and services. While well-intentioned, the edict was ultimately unsuccessful and difficult to enforce, but perhaps most significantly, Diocletian saw the spread of Christianity as a threat to imperial stability. In 303 AD, he issued a series of edicts ordering the destruction of churches, the burning of scriptures, and the imprisonment of clergy. Christians were barred from holding public office and could be compelled to make sacrifices to the Roman gods or face execution. It was the most severe persecution Christians had yet faced in the empire. Many met a martyr's fate in the arenas, including St. George, now immortalized as the patron saint of England. Despite the persecutions, Christianity continued to spread, and Diocletian's efforts to stamp it out would ultimately prove futile. In 305 AD, at the age of 60, Diocletian made the surprising decision to retire, becoming the first Roman emperor to voluntarily abdicate the throne. He retreated to his lavish palace on the Dalmatian coast, where he was said to have spent his days gardening. When asked to return to power a few years later, he reportedly replied, "If you could show the cabbage that I planted with my own hands to your emperor, he definitely wouldn't dare suggest that I replace the peace and happiness of this place with the storms of a never-satisfied greed." But Diocletian's dream of a peaceful retirement was not to be. Without his firm hand at the helm, the tetrarchy he had created quickly began to unravel. The Augusti and Caesars jockeyed for position, each seeking to become the sole ruler of the empire. The result was another round of civil wars, as rival claimants battled for supremacy. In the end, it was an ambitious young general named Constantine who would emerge victorious and take the empire in a radical new direction. The rise of Constantine marked a true turning point in Roman history. His reign saw the empire's official embrace of Christianity, the foundation of a new capital in the east, and a further centralization of imperial power. But to understand Constantine's impact, we must first delve into the story of his unlikely rise from obscure soldier to Emperor of the Romans. Constantine was born around the year 272 AD in the city of Nisus, in what is now Serbia. His father Constantius was an officer in the Roman army who would eventually rise to the rank of Augustus under Diocletian's tetrarchy. Constantine's mother Helena was of humble birth, and there were even rumors that she had worked in a tavern. But Constantine's parentage would prove less important than his own ambition and military skill. As a young man, Constantine served as a soldier in the court of Diocletian in the Eastern Empire. He quickly made a name for himself as a brave and capable warrior. When Diocletian abdicated in 305 AD, Constantine's father Constantius became Augustus of the Western Empire. Constantine, now in his early 30s, expected to be named as his father's Caesar, but he was passed over in favor of a man named Severus. Disappointed but undeterred, Constantine bided his time. When his father fell ill and died in Britain in 306 AD, Constantine was at his side. The army immediately proclaimed Constantine as Augustus, but this was not recognized by Galerius, the senior Augustus in the east. Galerius instead named Severus as Western Augustus and Constantine as Caesar. It was a tense situation, with multiple claimants vying for power. The next few years were a complex web of alliances, betrayals, and battles as Constantine maneuvered to secure his position. He formed an alliance with Maxentius, the son of Maximian, a former Augustus who had been forced to abdicate along with Diocletian. Together, they defeated and killed Severus. But the alliance soon soured, and Constantine and Maxentius became bitter rivals. The stage was set for a showdown between the two men in 312 AD. Maxentius was based in Rome and had a larger army. Constantine was in the north with a smaller force. But as Constantine marched toward Rome, he had a vision that would change the course of history. According to the account of Eusebius, Constantine's biographer, the emperor saw a cross of light in the sky above the sun, along with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Inspired by this vision, Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol of the Chi Rho, the first two letters of Christ in Greek, on their shields. When the two armies met at the Battle of Milvian Bridge just outside Rome, Constantine emerged victorious. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber River as he tried to flee. Constantine entered Rome in triumph, and the Senate proclaimed him the senior Augustus. The Battle of Milvian Bridge was a pivotal moment, not just for Constantine, but for the empire as a whole. It marked the beginning of Constantine's embrace of Christianity, which would have far-reaching consequences. In 313 AD, Constantine met with the Eastern Emperor Licinius, and together they issued the Edict of Milan, which granted religious tolerance throughout the empire and ended the persecutions of Christians. Over the next decade, Constantine gradually strengthened his position and eliminated his rivals one by one. In 324 AD, he defeated Licinius and became the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. He was now free to implement his vision of a Christian empire. In 325 AD, he convened the First Council of Nicaea, which sought to resolve disputes about the nature of Christ and establish orthodox Christian doctrine. But perhaps Constantine's most lasting legacy was the foundation of a new capital in the East. He chose the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, strategically located on the Bosphorus Strait. Over the next 6 years, the city was dramatically rebuilt and expanded. Walls were strengthened, grand new public buildings and churches were erected, and the city was filled with works of art from across the empire. In 330 AD, in an elaborate ceremony, the city was officially dedicated as Constantinople, the new Rome. The foundation of Constantinople was a recognition that the empire's center of gravity was shifting eastward. Rome would remain a ceremonial capital, but Constantinople would be the new seat of imperial power. It was a bold move, one that looked toward the empire's future rather than its past. When Constantine died in 337 AD, he was the first emperor to be baptized on his deathbed. He left behind an empire that was very different from the one he had inherited. Christianity was now the favored religion. The imperial capital had moved east, and power was more centralized than ever in the hands of the emperor. But he also left behind a problem. He had failed to create a clear plan for succession. Constantine's death sparked yet another round of civil wars, as his sons and nephews fought for control of the empire. The unified empire that Constantine had built would not last long beyond his death. In 395 AD, less than 60 years after Constantine's passing, the empire would officially split into eastern and western halves, never to be reunited. As we move into the twilight years of the Western Empire, we find an entity that is a mere shadow of its former self. Ravaged by invasions, drained by constant warfare and infighting, the once mighty Roman Empire in the West was now in a state of irreversible decline. The world of the 5th century was one where the empire was no longer the dominant force it had once been. Instead, it was struggling for survival in a sea of barbarian kingdoms. At the dawn of the 5th century, the Visigoths, a branch of the Gothic people, were on the move. They had been pushed westward by the Huns, a fierce nomadic people from Central Asia, and were now pressing on the empire's Danubian frontier. In 401 AD, under their king Alaric, the Visigoths invaded Italy itself. The Western Emperor Honorius, safe behind the marshes and walls of Ravenna, could do little to stop them. For the next decade, Alaric and his Visigoths ranged across the Balkans and Italy, alternately fighting against and serving in the Roman army as so-called foederati, or allies. The line between invader and mercenary had become blurred. In 408 AD, with the empire distracted by internal power struggles, Alaric saw his chance. He led his army to the gates of Rome and besieged the city. Rome had not been besieged by a foreign army for centuries. The shock and terror of the citizens must have been unimaginable. The once unassailable capital, the heart of a mighty empire, was now at the mercy of a barbarian king. After months of blockade and negotiation, Alaric lifted the siege in exchange for a massive payment in gold and silver. But it was only a temporary reprieve. In 410 AD, after further political intrigues and broken promises by the Romans, Alaric's patience ran out. This time, when he marched on Rome, he took the city by force. For 3 days, the age of Constantine marked a major turning point in Roman history. Constantine's rise to power came after a period of great turmoil and civil war that had torn the empire apart. Born in the province of Moesia to a military officer father, Constantine was well positioned for a life of imperial service. He began his career as a soldier, serving in the court of the Eastern Emperor Diocletian. But Constantine was ambitious, and he soon set his sights on greater things. In the year 312, Constantine marched on Rome itself to challenge his rival Maxentius. On the eve of the decisive battle at Milvian Bridge, Constantine reportedly had a vision. As the story goes, he saw a cross of light in the sky above the sun, along with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Inspired by this divine message, Constantine ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol of the Chi Rho, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek. Constantine's army was victorious that day, and he credited the Christian God for his triumph. This marked the beginning of Constantine's support for Christianity, a faith that had long been persecuted in the Roman Empire. In 313, just a year after the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine met with his eastern counterpart Licinius, and together they issued the Edict of Milan. This groundbreaking proclamation granted religious tolerance throughout the empire and legalized Christianity for the first time. But Constantine's embrace of Christianity was about more than just personal belief. It was also a shrewd political move. By aligning himself with this growing religion, Constantine could unify the fracturing empire under a new banner of faith. He began to funnel state resources into the construction of churches and granted Christians privileged positions in the government and military. At the same time, pagan temples saw their funding cut and their influence gradually wane. Perhaps the most visible symbol of Constantine's new Christian empire was his founding of a new capital city far to the east, Constantinople. Situated on the Bosporus Strait, this new Rome was to be a grand monument to Constantine's power and a beacon of Christian glory. The city was adorned with churches and public buildings bearing Christian iconography, a potent visual reminder of the shifting spiritual landscape of the empire. Constantine himself was baptized on his deathbed in 337, making him the first Roman emperor to be received into the Christian faith. By the end of his reign, Christianity had gone from a small, persecuted sect to the most powerful religion in the empire. This was a truly remarkable transformation, and one that would have profound consequences for the future of Rome and the entire Western world. But Constantine's legacy was not entirely triumphant. His embrace of Christianity also sowed the seeds of future conflict and division. Theological debates over the nature of Christ would lead to bitter disputes and even violence between different Christian factions. And the special status granted to the Church would create a powerful new force in Roman politics, one that emperors would struggle to control. Moreover, Constantine's decision to found a new capital in the east would ultimately accelerate the division of the empire. After his death, power was split between his three sons, who quickly fell to squabbling and civil war. The empire was eventually reunited under Constantine's son Constantius II, but the cracks were already beginning to show. The Western Empire, centered in Rome, was increasingly beset by barbarian invasions and economic turmoil, while the East grew in power and prestige. In many ways, the age of Constantine represents the last gasp of a unified Roman Empire. Never again would a single emperor rule over the whole of the Mediterranean world. The center of gravity was shifting inexorably eastward, and the old gods of Rome were slowly giving way to the new god of the Christians. It was a time of great change and upheaval, as the ancient world order crumbled and a new one struggled to be born. As we've seen, the decline of Rome was not due to any single cause, but rather to a complex interplay of factors: political, military, economic, and religious. The empire had been slowly weakening for centuries, its foundations eroded by corruption, internal strife, and external threats. But in the 4th century, these pressures would come to a head, setting the stage for the final act in the grand drama of Roman history. In our next chapter, we'll see how the barbarian tribes that had long menaced Rome's borders would finally break through, unleashing a tide of destruction that would sweep away the last vestiges of the Western Empire. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Huns, names that still evoke a sense of primal terror, would become the new masters of the Roman world, carving out kingdoms of their own from the ruins of the once mighty empire. It's a story of violence and chaos, but also of resilience and rebirth. For even as the Western Empire collapsed, the Eastern Empire would endure, preserving the legacy of Rome for another 1,000 years in the glittering city of Constantinople. And the barbarian kingdoms of the West would eventually give rise to the nations of medieval Europe, blending Roman and Germanic traditions into a new synthesis. So as we move into the final chapters of our story, keep in mind that the fall of Rome was not the end, but rather a new beginning. The world that emerged from the ashes of the empire would be very different from the one that came before, but it would also be shaped by the enduring influence of Roman culture, law, and religion. Even today, more than 1,500 years after the last Western emperor was deposed, we still live in the shadow of Rome, the eternal city that shaped the course of human history like no other. The fragile threads that had held the Western Roman Empire together for so long were rapidly unraveling. As the legions struggled to repel wave after wave of barbarian incursions, the political situation in Ravenna, the Western capital, grew increasingly dire. In the dimly lit halls of the imperial palace, a young boy sat uneasily upon a throne that must have seemed far too large for him. Romulus Augustus, known derisively as Augustulus or Little Augustus, had been crowned emperor in 475 AD at the tender age of just 14 or 15. But in truth, the real power behind the Western Empire now lay in the hands of Romulus's father, a general named Orestes. Orestes was a man caught in the middle, a Roman ruling over an empire that was Roman in name only. The ranks of the army were now filled almost entirely by Germanic foederati, barbarian mercenaries who fought for the empire in exchange for land and tribute. And it was these mercenaries who would spell the end of Orestes and his hapless son. In 476, the foederati approached Orestes with a bold demand. They wanted to settle permanently in Italy itself, the heart of the Western Empire. Orestes flatly refused. Italy was to remain in Roman hands, even if the rest of the empire crumbled around it. But Orestes had gravely underestimated the foederati and their ambitious leader, Odoacer. Odoacer was a Germanic warrior of the Shirii tribe. Serving in the Roman army, he had risen through the ranks to become a powerful general. When Orestes denied the foederati their land in Italy, Odoacer saw his opportunity. He gathered his loyal soldiers and marched on Ravenna, determined to seize by force what had been denied through diplomacy. Orestes, hopelessly outnumbered, fled the capital and sought refuge in the strategic city of Pavia. But there would be no refuge for the father of the last Western emperor. Odoacer pursued him, laying siege to Pavia and swiftly capturing the city. Orestes was dragged from his hiding place and swiftly executed, his blood staining the last vestiges of Roman authority. With Orestes dead, Odoacer turned his attention to Ravenna and the boy emperor Romulus Augustus. The young ruler was no threat to Odoacer. Indeed, he was more of a pitiful figure, a child playing dress-up in his father's robes. Odoacer saw no need to harm the boy. Instead, he simply deposed Romulus and sent him into quiet retirement in Campania. The reign of the last Western Roman emperor had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Odoacer now stood as the undisputed master of Italy. He chose not to proclaim himself emperor. After all, what was the point of claiming a title that had lost all meaning? Instead, he took the title of Rex Italiae, King of Italy. He sent the imperial regalia of the deposed Romulus to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, along with a message stating that the West no longer required a separate emperor. The Western Roman Empire was no more. For nearly a century afterward, historians would continue to speak of a separate Western Empire. But this was mere semantics, a hollow echo of past glory. In reality, Odoacer's ascension marked the true end of Roman rule in the West. The barbarian warlord who had once served as a mercenary for Rome now sat upon the throne of Italy, while the imperial court in Ravenna faded into myth and legend. Odoacer would rule Italy as a relatively stable and prosperous kingdom for the next 13 years. His reign, in many ways, was not so different from that of the later Western emperors. He made use of the old Roman bureaucracy and infrastructure. He issued coins in his name, and he negotiated with the Eastern Empire as a nominal subordinate, much as his imperial predecessors had done. But Odoacer was, in the end, still a barbarian king, not a Roman emperor. His rise to power marked a fundamental shift in the political order of the Mediterranean world. The last thin veneer of Roman legitimacy had been stripped away. revealing the naked truth that real political and military power now lay firmly in the hands of the Germanic warlords who had once been derided as uncouth savages. The fall of Romulus Augustulus and the ascent of Odoacer mark the moment when the great story of ancient Rome finally reached its long-delayed conclusion. The eternal city would endure, as would the eastern half of the empire ruled from distant Constantinople. But the dream of a unified Mediterranean world, bound together under the aegis of Rome's law and legion, had at last faded into the realm of nostalgia and romance. The Western Empire was gone, and the long twilight of late antiquity had given way to the dawn of a new era, the Middle Ages. It would be a time of great change and upheaval, a time when the old certainties of classical civilization would be swept away and replaced by new powers, new faiths, and new ways of looking at the world. The monks and knights of medieval Christendom would look back on ancient Rome as a golden age of supreme power and decadence, while the Muslim caliphs who conquered the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean would see themselves as the rightful heirs to Rome's imperial grandeur. But for all the long centuries that separated them from antiquity, the men and women of the Middle Ages could never entirely escape the shadow of Rome. The language of Latin, the Roman style of art and architecture, the legal codes of Justinian and Theodosius, the ideal of a universal empire ordained by God. All of these would shape the medieval world in profound and lasting ways, even as the political reality of the Roman Empire receded further and further into the mists of legend. Perhaps, then, it is fitting that the Western Roman Empire breathed its last under a ruler named Romulus. According to the ancient tales, it was another Romulus who had founded Rome some 12 centuries earlier. Romulus, the first king, who built his city on the Seven Hills and populated it with fugitives and outcasts. Now, with the abdication of Romulus Augustulus, the story had come full circle. The kingdom of Romulus had ended with the kingdom of another Romulus. The cycle was complete. Of course, the true reasons for Rome's fall were far more complex than the story of two bookending Romuli. Over the course of our journey through the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, we've explored the myriad factors that contributed to the slow unraveling of the world's greatest superpower. Economic instability, political corruption, religious upheaval, barbarian invasions, all played their part in bringing the mighty Colossus of Rome to its knees. But in the end, perhaps the most important lesson we can take from Rome's decline is a simple one, that no empire, no matter how grand or long-lived, can last forever. Every great power must someday face its own inevitable twilight. This is the fundamental truth that connects the fall of Rome to the rise and fall of so many other imperial powers throughout history. From the ancient empires of Persia and China to the colonial powers of the early modern period, from the British Empire at its Victorian zenith to the United States in the 21st century, the same underlying patterns can be seen time and time again. Prosperity breeds complacency, power breeds corruption, expansion breeds overreach. The mightiest empires may take centuries to fall, but fall they always do. The end of Roman power in the West was a pivotal turning point in the grand sweep of human history. It marked the boundary between the classical and medieval periods, the hinge that connected the world of Caesar and Cicero to the world of Charlemagne and William the Conqueror. The centuries that followed Rome's fall would see wrenching changes in every aspect of Western culture, from art and architecture, to religion and politics, to language and literature. Yet the eternal city itself would endure, rising from its early medieval nadir to once again become a center of power and culture. The Rome of the popes and the Renaissance was in many ways a very different place from the Rome of Augustus and Trajan, but it was still unmistakably Rome, a living link to the vanished world of antiquity. In the end, perhaps it is this enduring legacy more than anything else, that defines Rome's place in the story of human civilization. Long after the last emperor had surrendered his throne, long after the aqueducts and amphitheatres had crumbled to ruin, the idea of Rome lived on. The dream of a universal civilization, a world bound together by law and learning, by shared values and a common heritage. And so, even as we bid farewell to Romulus Augustulus and the fading remnants of the Western Empire, we cannot help but feel a sense of awe at the sheer scale and grandeur of the Roman achievement. For all its flaws and contradictions, for all the blood and toil and oppression that marked its rise and fall, there has never been anything quite like Rome before or since. It was and remains one of the great pivot points of human history, the hinge on which the fate of nations and peoples has so often turned. As we drift off to sleep, our minds filled with images of marble columns and imperial purple, of barbarian warlords and exiled boy emperors, we can perhaps take some small comfort in the knowledge that the story of Rome is, in the end, the story of all of us. It is the story of how a small, muddy village on the banks of the Tiber rose to conquer the world, only to be brought low by the weight of its own greatness. It is a mirror in which we can see reflected the hopes and fears, the triumphs and tragedies of our own civilization. And so, in the quiet hours of the night, let us dream of Rome as it once was and will never be again. A city of gods and emperors, of glory and decadence, of power and beauty unmatched in human history. Let us wander its ancient streets and marvel at its timeless grandeur, even as we whisper a soft and reverent farewell to the last fading light of the Western Empire. Ave atque vale, Roma aeterna. Hail and farewell, eternal Rome. The economic troubles that had been brewing for centuries finally boiled over in the 3rd century AD. The silver denarius, which had been the backbone of the Roman currency for nearly 500 years, began to be debased. In a desperate attempt to stretch limited silver supplies, emperors mixed in less precious metals like bronze and copper. Under Emperor Caracalla in the early 200s AD, the silver content of a denarius fell to just 50%. By 250 AD, it was a mere 5% silver. The once proud denarius was now little more than a bronze coin with a thin silver coating. Imagine the public's loss of faith as they saw their money losing value before their eyes. Severe inflation took hold as a result. With more coins in circulation but no increase in actual value, prices skyrocketed. A measure of Egyptian wheat that once cost 7 drachmas soared to 120,000 drachmas by the end of the 3rd century. The price of everyday goods was utterly out of control. This economic crisis coincided with a period of political upheaval known as the crisis of the 3rd century, or the imperial crisis. Between 235 and 284 AD, over 20 different men held the title of emperor, mostly through violent usurpation rather than peaceful succession. In a 50-year span, only one emperor died of natural causes. The rest met their ends through assassination, suicide, or death in battle. The average reign lasted just 2 to 3 years. In 238 AD, a shocking 6 emperors came and went in a single chaotic year. With such instability at the top, effective governance became nearly impossible. Tax collection, infrastructure, and frontier defense fell into disarray. One of the most disastrous moments came in 260 AD under Emperor Valerian. Valerian marched his legions east to confront the rising power of the Sasanian Persian Empire. But in a shocking humiliation, the Persians outmaneuvered Valerian and took the emperor himself as a prisoner of war. Imagine the blow to Roman prestige. Their emperor, the mighty ruler who was supposed to be a living god, was now a captive in Persia, never to return. Some accounts even claim that upon Valerian's death, the Persian king Shapur I used the emperor's body as a footstool and his preserved skin as a trophy. How far the glory of Rome had fallen. The ripples of this unprecedented disaster spread far and wide. In the absence of central authority, regional commanders seized power for themselves. The Gallic Empire broke away in the west, controlling Britain, Gaul, and Spain. In the east, the Palmyrene Empire claimed sovereignty over the crucial provinces of Syria and Egypt. For a decade and a half, these separatist empires challenged the supremacy of Rome. It's as if the United States today lost control of California and Texas, and they became de facto independent countries. The Roman Empire's days as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean were over. The crisis of the 3rd century demonstrated that the imperial system was not too big to fail. Cracks in the political foundations, economic bedrock, and military might could bring even the greatest superpower to its knees. And although the empire would limp on for another 200 years, many historians pinpoint this crisis as the beginning of Rome's terminal decline. It would take a leader of remarkable ability to stitch the tattered empire back together and attempt to set it on a more stable path. Fortunately for Rome, the man who would rise to that challenge was already waiting in the wings, biding his time to take the purple robes of imperial power. His name was Diocletian, and he would institute the most sweeping reforms the Roman world had ever seen. Born to a humble family in the province of Dalmatia around 244 AD, no one could have predicted that Diocletian would one day rule the empire. He began his climb, like many ambitious men of the age, through a career in the military. Distinguishing himself with his courage and tactical prowess, Diocletian served in the elite cavalry corps and became a member of the imperial bodyguard. But Diocletian's real opportunity came when his patron, the general Numerian, died under mysterious circumstances during a Persian campaign in 284 AD. With the backing of the powerful army, Diocletian had himself proclaimed emperor and quickly eliminated any rivals. Now, at age 40, this son of a scribe found himself the master of the Roman world. Diocletian wasted no time implementing his vision. Realizing that the empire had grown too large and unruly for one man to effectively govern, he instituted a system called the tetrarchy, or rule of 4. The empire would be split into eastern and western halves, with each half governed by a senior emperor called an Augustus and a junior emperor called a Caesar. The two Augusti, Diocletian in the east and Maximian in the west, would be co-emperors with equal power. The two Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, would handle frontline military duties and were intended to be the designated successors. When the Augusti retired or died, the Caesars would be promoted to Augusti and appoint new Caesars beneath them. It was an orderly system of power sharing and succession, meant to prevent the destructive civil wars and power struggles of the past. To further improve administrative efficiency, Diocletian doubled the number of provinces from 50 to almost 100 and grouped them into 12 dioceses governed by vicars. This created a more layered bureaucracy that, while perhaps slowing down decision-making, also allowed the imperial government to extend its reach into local matters more than ever before. Diocletian also sought to address the severe economic problems plaguing the empire. To tame the rampant inflation, he issued his famous edict on maximum prices in 301 AD. This edict set price ceilings for over 1,000 goods and services, from a pound of ivory or a lawyer's fee to a bag of dates or a bunch of lettuce. Violating these price controls was punishable by death. But like many attempts at top-down price setting throughout history, the edict backfired spectacularly. Merchants simply refused to sell their goods at the artificially low prices, leading to widespread shortages. A thriving black market emerged to circumvent the controls. In the end, the edict on maximum prices proved unenforceable and was largely ignored after Diocletian's reign. Perhaps the most infamous aspect of Diocletian's rule was his zealous persecution of Christians. Unlike the localized and sporadic persecutions of the past, Diocletian initiated an empire-wide effort to suppress Christianity, which he saw as a dangerous threat to traditional Roman religion and values. In 303 AD, Diocletian ordered the destruction of all Christian scriptures and places of worship. Christians were stripped of their rights and barred from government offices. The next year, all inhabitants of the empire were required to publicly sacrifice to the Roman gods or face imprisonment, torture, and execution. Harrowing stories emerged of Christians being thrown to wild beasts in the arena, burned alive, or worked to death in mines and quarries. The scale and ferocity of the Great Persecution was unprecedented. But far from stamping out this upstart religion, Diocletian's efforts only hardened Christian resolve and earned the Church a new generation of martyr heroes. In a bitter irony, just a few years later, Christianity would become the favoured faith of the empire under Constantine the Great. Diocletian's 20-year reign came to a close with his voluntary abdication in 305 AD, making him the first Roman emperor to ever retire from office. He retreated to his massive fortified palace in his native Dalmatia and took up gardening in his retirement years, far from the intrigues of imperial power. The tetrarchy he had so carefully designed soon unravelled without him. The orderly succession plan fell apart as the various co-emperors schemed and battled against each other. It appeared Diocletian's work had been in vain, and the empire was doomed to fall back into chaos and civil war. But even if the tetrarchy was ultimately unsuccessful, Diocletian had undoubtedly pulled the empire back from the brink and bought it precious time. His military victories had secured the frontiers. His administrative reforms had restored some measure of central control, and even his failed economic policies demonstrated an emperor who was willing to take bold action to solve the empire's problems. Most importantly, Diocletian had reimagined what the role of the emperor could be. No longer just a first citizen bound by the precedents of the past, the emperor was now an absolute monarch, unquestioned in his authority, decked in imperial purple and adorned with a jeweled diadem. His person was sacred, his every pronouncement the word of law. This model of sacred, absolutist kingship would endure and spread far beyond Rome, becoming the dominant template for monarchy in Europe and the Mediterranean world for well over 1,000 years. In this sense, even as the empire he governed crumbled away, Diocletian cast a long shadow over the future of rulership. But for all his accomplishments, Diocletian's reign also marked a point of no return for the troubled empire. The days of expansion and splendor were gone. The crisis had been staved off for a time, but the cracks in the foundation could no longer be ignored. An empire that had once seemed eternal was entering its twilight years. The sun was setting on the old Rome of marble temples and triumphal processions. But as that light faded, a new Rome was rising in the east, one that would carry on the legacy of empire in a Christian guise. At the dawn of the 4th century, the stage was set for the rise of Constantinople and the birth of the Byzantine Empire. All it needed was a visionary emperor to lead the way. As the Western Roman Empire breathed its last, the world shifted on its axis. The grand empire that once stretched from the mists of Britannia to the sands of Syria, the civilization that gave us the Colosseum, the aqueducts, and the Pax Romana was no more. In its place, a patchwork of kingdoms vied for power, each eager to claim a piece of Rome's legacy. But what of the Eastern Empire, the other half of Rome's once mighty dominion? From his glittering capital of Constantinople, the Emperor Zeno looked warily westward. The East had weathered the storm far better than its counterpart. The Huns and Goths had battered at the gates, but the walls of Constantinople held firm. The imperial bureaucracy, the economy, the military, all remained intact. Yet Zeno knew he sat on a precarious throne. the Eastern Empire may have endured, but it was forever altered. Gone were the days when Roman legions marched out to expand the empire's frontiers. Now, the task was to defend what remained. The Eastern emperors increasingly looked inward, focusing on palace intrigues and religious debates, while the world outside shifted and changed. In many ways, the Eastern Empire was a different beast than the one founded by Augustus so many centuries before. Greek, not Latin, was the lingua franca. The imperial cult faded as Christianity rose to dominance. The once proud Senate was reduced to a rubber stamp. But still, the people clung to their Roman identity. They called themselves Romaioi, the Romans, even as the centuries slipped by and the empire of old retreated into memory. For over 1,000 years, the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, as historians would come to call it, endured. It was a journey filled with triumphs and tragedies, golden ages and great catastrophes. In the reign of Justinian the Great, the empire recaptured a portion of its lost Western glory, from the steppes of Ukraine to the coast of Tunisia. But his reconquests proved fleeting, undone by overstretched resources and the implacable march of the centuries. The Byzantines faced foes on all sides: Arabs, Persians, Slavs, Normans, Turks. They dazzled the world with the splendors of the Hagia Sophia, even as their armies battled for survival. The Great Palace witnessed the rise of ruthless strongmen and feeble figureheads, generals and bureaucrats, saints and sinners. Time and again, the empire teetered on the brink of destruction, only to find some hidden reserve of strength to carry on. But no empire, no matter how resilient, can last forever. Dynasties came and went: Macedonians, Komnenoi, Palaiologoi, each unable to halt the empire's slow decline. Latin crusaders sacked the city in 1204, an unthinkable humiliation from so-called allies. The Ottoman Turks carved away swathes of territory until the once mighty empire was reduced to little more than the city of Constantinople itself. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. On May 29th, 1453, after a prolonged siege, the Ottomans breached the city walls. The last emperor, Constantine XI, tore the imperial regalia from his body and plunged into the fray, never to be seen again. And with that, the Roman dream was over. The empire of Augustus and Trajan, Constantine and Justinian, had finally met an enemy it could not outlast. The story of Rome's downfall is a tale of human folly and happenstance, of choices made and roads not taken. It is a reminder that even the mightiest of empires can crumble given time. Yet for all the centuries since Rome fell, its legacy endures in our language, our laws, our very way of thinking about the world. The eternal city casts a long shadow. And so, my fellow armchair historian, we come to the end of our journey through the tumultuous final centuries of Rome. I hope this exploration of antiquity has been an enlightening companion on your journey to dreamland. If this peek into the past has piqued your curiosity, consider subscribing to our channel. There are so many more stories to uncover together on this pillow-soft passage through the ages. For now though, close your eyes. Let my voice fade into the distance and drift off to visions of emperors and legions, of a world both strange and strangely familiar. Sweet dreams.